At one point in human history, healing often hurt more than the illness itself. People cut into their own bodies, swallowed poison, burned their skin, and trusted rituals over certainty, all in the hope of surviving one more day. These methods were not rare, hidden, or extreme exceptions, but everyday responses to pain in a world without answers. What feels unthinkable now was once normal, accepted, and repeated. Tonight we step back into that fragile world and follow how survival was chased through fear, belief, and endurance. So before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one were to step far back beyond written memory before names were fixed and stories were recorded, the world of prehistoric people would appear unfamiliar and fragile, shaped entirely by forces they could not control. There were no books to explain illness, no trained hands to diagnose pain, and no shared knowledge that could be preserved beyond what one generation managed to pass to the next by word of mouth. Life unfolded in a narrow space between survival and sudden death, and health was never a stable condition. It was something that could vanish without warning. In this early world, the human body was not understood as a system of organs or functions. Pain did not belong to nerves, and fever did not belong to infection. Illness was simply something that happened to a person, often without visible cause. A child could wake with strength one day and collapse the next. An adult could hunt, walk, and speak, then suddenly lose control of their limbs or breath. With no way to see inside the body, there was no separation between physical suffering and unseen forces. What could not be explained was not questioned. It was accepted as part of the natural order. Nature was not a background to life. It was life itself. Food, shelter, warmth, and safety all came from direct contact with the environment. Rain decided on hunger. Cold decided survival. Animals were both sustenance and threat. Plants could heal or kill, often without warning. The human body was constantly exposed, unprotected by technology or infrastructure. Injuries were common, and even minor wounds could become fatal. Infection had no name, but its results were familiar. Because survival depended so heavily on nature, prehistoric people did not view themselves as separate from it. They did not imagine the body as something to be repaired through technique. Instead, the body was part of a wider balance. When illness arrived, it was rarely seen as random. Something had gone wrong in the relationship between the person and the world around them. This belief shaped how sickness was understood and how healing was attempted. Without writing, knowledge existed only as memory. What one group learned could easily be lost if the people who carried that knowledge were to die. Healing methods were therefore inconsistent and often contradictory. One group might believe cold caused illness while another blamed heat. One might avoid certain foods while another relied on them. What mattered was not accuracy, but repetition. If something seemed to work once, it was remembered. If it failed, it was often overlooked or attributed to other factors. Doctors, as we understand them, did not exist. There were no specialists whose role was purely to heal. Instead, healing was woven into daily life. Elders, shamans, or individuals believed to have special connections to the unseen world took on the role of guiding the sick. Their authority came not from proof, but from trust and tradition. They were not expected to cure every illness. Failure did not weaken their position, because illness itself was not seen as something fully within human control. The absence of medicine did not mean the absence of care. People observed, experimented, and adapted within the limits of their understanding. They noticed patterns, even if they interpreted them through belief rather than science. Certain plants eased pain, certain rituals calmed fear, certain actions seemed to bring recovery more often than others. These observations formed the earliest foundations of healing, though they were surrounded by misunderstanding and risk. Illness was also deeply social. When one person became sick, it affected the entire group. A hunter unable to walk meant less food. A child with a fever meant anxiety for the future. Care required time and attention, both of which came at a cost. Healing was therefore never only about the individual body. It was about maintaining the stability of the group. This pressure often shaped how aggressively sickness was treated, even when those treatments caused further harm. In the absence of explanation, belief filled the gap. Disease was often linked to spirits, ancestors, or unseen beings. Pain was interpreted as punishment, warning, or intrusion. Healing was not simply an attempt to restore the body, but an effort to restore balance with forces beyond human reach. This worldview made sense in a world where control was limited and danger was constant. It provided meaning where knowledge could not. The prehistoric understanding of illness was not naive in its own context. It was practical in a harsh environment. People worked with what they had: observation, belief, repetition, and hope. They accepted that many would not survive. Death was familiar, not exceptional. Healing was less about certainty and more about attempt. To do nothing was rarely an option. Action, even dangerous action, felt better than helplessness. What is striking from a modern perspective is not simply how little was known, but how normal this uncertainty was. There was no expectation that illness could always be cured. There was no promise of recovery. Sickness was part of life in the same way hunger and cold were. It was endured, managed, and sometimes feared but rarely challenged as something that should not exist. Living without medicine meant living with constant risk. Every cut, every cough, every unexplained pain carried the possibility of death. Yet life continued. People formed, families, raised children, and developed cultures under these conditions. Healing, however flawed, was an essential part of this effort. It represented humanity's earliest attempts to resist suffering, even when the tools available were limited and often harmful. From this foundation, all later medical practices would emerge, not through sudden insight, but through long accumulation, through trial, error, and loss. Understanding this early period is not about judging the past. It is about recognizing how vulnerable human life once was, and how deeply belief and survival were intertwined. This early world shows a time when illness had no clear cause, and healing had no clear rules. When pain could not be explained, people turned to forces they believed controlled life itself, and from that belief came actions that would leave marks on human bodies in ways that still raise difficult questions. Illness in prehistoric societies was rarely understood as a failure of the body alone. Pain, fever, seizures, and sudden weakness were not traced to wounds or internal causes. They were seen as signs that something unseen had entered the person. A sickness was not just happening to the body, it was happening to the soul or to the space around it. When someone fell ill, the question was not what had gone wrong inside them, but which force had chosen them. Spirits, ancestors, and unseen beings formed a constant presence in daily life. They were believed to move freely through forests, caves, rivers, and camps. These forces could protect or punish, help or destroy. Illness was often interpreted as a message. Sometimes it meant that a spirit had been offended. Sometimes it meant that an ancestor was angry or neglected. In other cases, it meant that an evil presence had attached itself to the body. The exact explanation mattered less than the certainty that sickness did not come without reason. Because of this belief, healing was never purely physical. Treating illness meant addressing the invisible cause behind it. A wound could be cleaned or bound, but if fever followed, it was assumed that the spirit had not been satisfied. Pain that lingered was taken as proof that the unseen force was still present. Recovery required more than rest. It required negotiation with powers that could not be seen or touched. Ritual became the central response to sickness. When a person collapsed or began behaving strangely, the group did not look for herbs first. They looked for signs. They asked what had changed. Had the person broken a rule? Had they entered a forbidden place? Had they angered something older and stronger than themselves? Illness was treated as a social and spiritual problem, not an individual one. Offerings were made to restore balance. Food, animal parts, or objects believed to hold value were placed in specific locations. Fire was used not just for warmth but as a signal. Smoke carried prayers upward, where spirits were believed to dwell. Words were spoken carefully, often repeated exactly as they had been taught, because the wrong phrase could make things worse. Healing depended on precision, not in technique, but in ritual. Calling the soul back was another common practice. It was believed that illness could cause a person's soul to wander or be taken. A sick individual who seemed distant or unresponsive was thought to be partially absent. The solution was not medicine, but summoning. Names were called aloud. Familiar objects were placed near the person. Sounds were used to guide the soul back to the body. Recovery, when it happened, was taken as proof that the ritual had worked. Exorcism also played a role. If a sickness was violent or frightening, it was often blamed on an invading force. Shouting, striking the ground, and aggressive movements were used to drive the presence away. The goal was not comfort, but removal. The suffering of the patient during these rituals was accepted as necessary. Pain was interpreted as resistance from the force being expelled. At the center of these practices stood the shaman or spiritual healer. This figure did not gain authority through study or experimentation. Their power came from belief and reputation. They were thought to communicate with the unseen world to understand its rules and demands. Some were chosen because of unusual experiences, such as surviving severe illness or displaying strange behavior. Others inherited the role through lineage. What mattered was not proof, but acceptance. The shaman was not expected to succeed every time. Death did not discredit them. If a patient died, it meant the spirits had refused the offering or the illness had progressed too far. Responsibility was placed on the force, not the healer. This allowed the system to continue without challenge. Failure reinforced belief rather than undermining it. Fear played a quiet role in maintaining these practices. Without understanding disease, illness was terrifying. Seizures, hallucinations, and sudden death appeared without warning. Belief provided structure. It explained the unexplainable and offered a sense of control. Ritual created action where there would otherwise be helplessness. Even dangerous or painful practices felt better than waiting. These beliefs also shaped how the sick were treated within the group. Illness could bring care, but it could also bring suspicion. A person believed to be touched by evil might be isolated. In some cases, sickness was seen as contagious, not only physically but spiritually. Keeping distance was a form of protection. Healing rituals often happened at the edge of camps or in separate spaces, reinforcing the idea that illness was something apart. From a modern perspective, these practices appear misguided or cruel, but in their context they were consistent with how the world was understood. Without knowledge of bacteria, organs, or infection, invisible forces were the most logical explanation. Healing meant restoring harmony with those forces. The body was not repaired, it was negotiated over. This belief system would leave lasting marks on human behavior. Long after physical explanations emerged, traces of spiritual healing would remain. The idea that illness carries meaning, that suffering has purpose, did not disappear easily. It had been woven into survival itself. In this world, sickness was never just a condition of flesh, but a sign of broken balance. Healing meant confronting forces that could not be seen, only feared or respected. And once illness was understood this way, the actions taken to remove it could become as dangerous as the sickness itself. Blood held a special meaning in prehistoric thinking. It was not simply a substance that flowed through the body. It was life itself, visible and powerful. When a person weakened, when pain lingered, or when fever refused to fade, the cause was often believed to lie within the blood. Something had spoiled it, something harmful had entered and settled there. Illness in this view was not an invasion from outside alone, but a corruption from within. The idea of bad blood explained many fears. Blood could be seen unlike spirits or breath. It spilled when skin was cut and darkened when it dried. Its color and smell changed with injury and sickness. To prehistoric people, these changes felt meaningful. If blood looked wrong, then blood must be wrong. And if blood carried life, then removing the wrong blood seemed like a logical step toward survival. Cutting the body was therefore not an act of desperation, but of intention. Sharp stones, flakes of flint, animal teeth, or thorns were used to pierce the skin. These tools were crude but effective. They tore flesh quickly and caused blood to flow freely. The pain was immediate and severe, but pain was not seen as a problem. Pain meant something was happening. Pain meant action. The location of the cuts mattered. If a limb hurt, the cut was made there. If the head throbbed, blood was taken from near the scalp or neck. In cases shown by skeletal remains, repeated cuts were made in the same areas, suggesting that bloodletting was not a rare act, but a practiced response. It was repeated because it was believed to work, or at least to be necessary. When blood flowed, it was watched closely. The act itself carried meaning. The sight of dark blood leaving the body created the impression that illness was being released. The more blood that came out, the stronger the belief that the poison was being removed. Bleeding was sometimes encouraged by squeezing the wound or by making multiple cuts. Stopping the flow too early could be seen as dangerous, as if the sickness had not fully escaped. After the bloodletting, the wound was rarely cleaned in any controlled way. There was no understanding of bacteria or infection. Dirt, ash, or plant matter might be applied often for symbolic reasons rather than hygienic ones. These substances could introduce further harm, but if the patient survived, survival was attributed to the success of the blood removal, not questioned further. Infections were common. Swelling, fever, and worsening pain often followed. From a modern view, these were signs of injury becoming deadly. From a prehistoric perspective, they could be interpreted as the sickness fighting back or leaving the body in stages. Continued suffering did not immediately discredit the practice. It often reinforced it. More blood could be taken to finish what had begun. Bloodletting also carried a sense of fairness. Illness was invisible and unfair. Cutting the body made suffering visible. It created balance. The pain inflicted was controlled, unlike the pain caused by sickness. This sense of control mattered. To choose when and how pain occurred was preferable to waiting helplessly for the disease to act. Children were not spared from these practices. Skeletal evidence suggests that young individuals were also subjected to cuts. A sick child represented a threat to the group's future. Removing bad blood was seen as an urgent necessity. The smaller the body, the greater the risk, but this risk was rarely understood. Loss of blood in children could quickly lead to weakness and death. Yet death was often blamed on the strength of the illness, not the treatment. In some cases, bloodletting may have brought temporary relief. Reducing pressure in swollen areas or releasing trapped blood from injuries might have eased pain. These rare successes strengthened belief. People remembered the few who survived, not the many who did not. Memory favored hope over accuracy. There was also a ritual dimension to the act. Blood was sometimes collected, observed, or even offered. It might be placed on the ground near fire or in areas believed to be watched by spirits. Removing blood was not only a medical act but a symbolic one. It showed willingness to sacrifice part of oneself in exchange for health. The trust placed in this practice reveals how limited the choices were. Doing nothing felt dangerous. Waiting felt like surrender. Bloodletting offered a response that matched the seriousness of illness. It was decisive, visible, and immediate. Even when it failed, it felt purposeful. From a modern perspective, it is easy to see the harm. Uncontrolled bleeding weakened already sick bodies. Open wounds invited infection. Pain increased stress. But prehistoric people were not weighing outcomes with statistics. They were responding to fear, observation, and belief. They used what they could see and touch. Blood was something they understood, even if that understanding was incomplete. This practice would not disappear quickly. Versions of bloodletting survived for thousands of years, long after writing and medicine began to develop. The belief that blood could carry disease was deeply rooted. It began here in a world where survival depended on action more than understanding. Bloodletting stands as one of the earliest examples of humans trying to force illness out of the body. It shows a willingness to harm to heal. It shows how desperation shapes logic, and it shows how easily suffering can be mistaken for a cure. In this approach, sickness was treated as something that could be drained away by force. Cutting the body became a way to confront illness directly, even when the body itself was weakened by the act. But when blood failed to bring relief, people began to look for even more extreme ways to open the body itself. Opening the skull was not seen as madness in prehistoric healing. It was seen as a direct response to unbearable suffering. When headaches became relentless, when seizures twisted the body without warning, or when a person began to behave in ways that frightened others, the problem was believed to be trapped inside the head. Something unseen was pressing outward, searching for escape. The skull was not viewed as a protective boundary in the modern sense, but as a barrier that could imprison harmful forces. Trepanation, the act of drilling or scraping a hole into the skull, emerged from this belief. It was practiced independently across continents from Europe and Africa to the Americas and Asia. This wide distribution suggests that the idea did not spread from one culture alone. It arose again and again, wherever people struggled to explain sudden neurological suffering. When the head was the source of pain, the head became the focus of action. The procedure was carried out with stone tools, often flint or obsidian chosen for their sharp edges. The process was slow and deliberate. Rather than striking through the skull, healers scraped layer by layer, carefully removing bone until an opening appeared. This was not a hurried act. Skeletal evidence shows smooth edges around many trepanation holes, indicating controlled and repeated movement rather than brute force. Pain was inevitable. There was no anesthesia, no understanding of nerves, and no way to prevent shock. The patient was often restrained or held by others. In some cases, the individual undergoing the procedure may already have been weakened by illness or seizures. Survival depended not only on the healer's skill, but on the body's ability to endure extreme trauma. Why would anyone accept such a procedure? Because the alternative felt worse. A person plagued by constant pain or unpredictable convulsions was already considered close to death. If spirits were trapped inside the skull, then releasing them was the only remaining option. The risk of death from the procedure was acknowledged, but death from inaction felt just as likely. The opening in the skull served a symbolic purpose as much as a physical one. It created a visible exit. Blood flowed, air entered, and pressure seemed to change. To those watching this, confirmed that something had been released. If the patient calmed afterward, even briefly, it was taken as proof that the evil force had left. What makes trepanation especially unsettling is the evidence of survival. Many skulls show signs of healing around the edges of the opening. Bone regrowth indicates that some individuals lived months or even years after the procedure. These survivors reinforced belief in the practice. Their existence suggested that opening the skull could save lives, even if many others died during or shortly after the attempt. The reasons for survival remain uncertain. Some cases may have involved head injuries where relieving pressure actually helped. Others may have coincided with illnesses that would have improved on their own. These rare successes were remembered and repeated. Failures, as with other prehistoric treatments, were often explained away. The spirits had been too strong. The illness had gone too far. Trepanation was not reserved for the elderly. Evidence suggests that adults of various ages underwent the procedure, and possibly adolescents as well. The decision was not taken lightly, but once made, hesitation was dangerous. To stop midway could mean trapping the force inside again. Completion mattered more than caution. After the opening was made, the wound was sometimes covered with plant matter, animal skin, or simple bindings. There was no concept of sterile care. Infection was common, but infection was not understood as a separate danger. Swelling or fever afterward could be interpreted as part of the healing struggle, not a sign of failure. The person who performed trepanation held immense authority. This was not a task for anyone. It required steady hands and deep trust. The healer's role blended physical action with spiritual negotiation. Words were spoken, gestures repeated, and rituals performed before, during, and after the act. The hole in the skull was not just a medical opening. It was a spiritual doorway. Fear surrounded these moments. Those watching understood the risk. They saw blood, heard cries, and waited in silence for signs of survival. When the patient lived, relief spread through the group. When the patient died, grief followed, but rarely doubt. The logic of the world remained intact. The unseen forces had simply refused to leave. From a modern viewpoint, trepanation appears horrific. Opening the skull without medical knowledge seems reckless beyond belief. Yet within its context, it represented determination rather than ignorance. It was an attempt to confront illness at its source, to act decisively when other methods had failed. It reflected a worldview where suffering demanded response no matter the cost. This practice reveals how far humans were willing to go in the absence of understanding. The head, the seat of thought and behavior, became a battleground. Cutting into it was a last resort, but a meaningful one. It showed that prehistoric healing was not passive. It was invasive, dangerous, and driven by belief rather than restraint. Trepanation stands as one of the clearest examples of early medical extremity. It crossed the boundary between care and harm. It blurred the line between healing and sacrifice. And it left permanent marks on human remains that still disturb those who study them. This act turned the human skull into a gateway rather than a shield. When pain and fear concentrated in the head opening, it felt like the only possible release. But once the bone itself was breached, the question of how far healing should go no longer had a clear limit. Fire occupied a central place in prehistoric life. It brought warmth, kept predators away, and made food safer to eat. Because of this, fire was never seen as neutral. It was powerful, alive, and capable of changing things. When illness and injury resisted other attempts at healing, fire became an obvious tool. If sickness was caused by something harmful or impure, then fire, which transformed everything it touched, seemed capable of driving it out. Wounds were common in prehistoric communities. Cuts from stone tools, animal bites, and injuries from falls happened regularly. When a wound failed to close or began to smell, it was feared. The body was believed to be invaded. In these moments, heat was applied directly. A burning stick, heated stone, or glowing ember was brought close to the injured flesh. The goal was not comfort, it was a confrontation. Fire was meant to force the sickness away. The pain was immediate and intense. Flesh tightened, burned, and blistered. Screams were not unusual, but they were not seen as signs to stop. Pain meant that the fire was working. Pain meant resistance was being met. If the patient fainted, it could even be interpreted as success, as though the harmful force had been overwhelmed. In some cases, fire may have helped without anyone understanding why. Heat can destroy bacteria and seal blood vessels. When bleeding slowed or infection did not spread, survival followed. These rare outcomes strengthened belief. People remembered the wounds that closed, not the ones that worsened. Fire earned its place as a healing tool through coincidence and repetition. Ash played a different but related role. After fire burned wood or plants, what remained was dry, fine, and grey. Ash was believed to carry the essence of fire without its danger. It was often sprinkled into wounds to stop bleeding. The powder absorbed moisture and gave the appearance of control. Blood darkened the ash and then slowed, reinforcing the belief that the ash was effective. The symbolic meaning of ash mattered as much as its physical effect. Fire destroyed, ash remained. Applying ash suggested that the destructive force had already passed, and what was left could now protect. Some ashes came from specific sources. Certain woods, ritual fires, or sacred locations were preferred. The choice was deliberate. Not all ash was equal. Ash was also used because it was available. In a world with limited resources, what was close at hand mattered. Fire was always present. Ash required no preparation. It could be applied quickly, which felt important when blood flowed freely. Speed mattered more than safety. The combination of fire and ash created a complete process. Fire attacked the sickness. Ash sealed the result. Together they formed a method that felt logical and powerful. The wound was punished, purified, and closed. Healing was framed as a struggle that had been won. Yet the dangers were severe. Burns could deepen wounds rather than heal them. Tissue damage increased the risk of infection. Ash was rarely clean. It could contain dirt, animal waste, or harmful particles. Applying it to open flesh often introduced new problems. But when swelling or fever followed, these reactions were rarely blamed on the treatment. They were seen as part of the body's response or evidence that the illness was still present. Children were not excluded from these practices. A bleeding or infected wound on a child was frightening. Fire offered a decisive solution. The smaller body suffered more, but suffering itself was not the measure of failure. Death, when it occurred, was blamed on the injury or fate. The method remained unquestioned. Fire was also used beyond visible wounds. Heated stones were placed near painful areas. Smoke was directed toward the body. Flames were waved near limbs or the torso. The belief was consistent. Heat chased away what should not be there. Cold stiffness and weakness were signs that something had settled into the body. Fire pushed it out. From a modern perspective, these actions appear brutal. Burning flesh to promote healing seems cruel and unnecessary. But prehistoric people did not view the body as fragile in the same way. Survival itself required enduring pain. Fire was familiar and trusted. If it could protect camps and cook food, it could also protect the body. What makes this practice unsettling is how close it comes to effectiveness by accident. Fire does kill microbes. Heat can stop bleeding. These truths were not understood, but they were occasionally observed. This accidental success allowed a dangerous method to persist. It blurred the line between help and harm. The use of fire and ash reveals a pattern seen throughout early healing practices. When knowledge was limited, intensity replaced precision. Strong actions felt more meaningful than careful ones. Healing became an act of force rather than understanding. Fire did not ask for subtlety. It transformed everything, or destroyed it. Bringing it to the body showed how far people were willing to go to resist illness. It also showed how easily a tool of survival could become a source of suffering. This approach to healing left scars that would not fade. Burn marks on bone and tissue tell a quiet story of pain endured in the name of recovery. They remind us that early medicine often balanced on the edge between life-saving and life-threatening. Here, healing meant confronting sickness with heat strong enough to scar the body. Fire and ash offered a sense of control in moments ruled by fear, even when that control was purchased through pain. Once burning was accepted as treatment, gentler responses quietly lost their place. Eating the organs of animals was not viewed as consumption alone in prehistoric societies. It was an exchange. Strength, courage, endurance, and vitality were believed to reside in specific parts of the body, and by eating those parts, a person could take those qualities into themselves. Among all organs, the heart and the liver held special importance. They were associated with life, blood, and power. When illness weakened a person, these organs became tools of restoration. Wild animals were admired for what humans lacked. They ran longer, fought harder, survived harsher conditions, and recovered quickly from wounds. Their strength was visible and undeniable. Prehistoric people did not separate physical ability from spiritual essence. If an animal were powerful, then its power had to exist somewhere inside it. The heart, which beat until death, and the liver, which processed blood and food, seemed like obvious vessels of that power. When a person suffered from weakness, fatigue, or symptoms we would now associate with heart or liver disease, the response was not rest or isolation. It was an acquisition. The organs of a strong animal were prepared and eaten, sometimes raw, sometimes lightly cooked over fire. Cooking was not always preferred. Raw consumption was believed to preserve more of the animal's essence. Heat might weaken what was being absorbed. This practice was especially common after hunts. The act of killing the animal was already charged with meaning. Sharing its organs extended that meaning into healing. The strongest hunter, or the sickest individual, often received the heart or liver. Eating these parts was not casual. It was deliberate and often accompanied by ritual. Silent, specific gestures or spoken words reinforced the belief that strength was being transferred. In cases of sexual weakness or infertility, the liver was often chosen. It was associated with vitality and growth. In cases of chest pain, breathlessness, or fainting, the heart was favored. The logic was direct, restored. If the organ failed, then consuming a stronger version of it could repair the weakness. There was no understanding of toxins, parasites, or disease transmission. Wild animals could carry illnesses harmful to humans, but these risks were invisible. When sickness followed the consumption of organs, it was rarely blamed on the practice itself. The animal might have been spiritually tainted, or the ritual incomplete. The idea that the food itself was dangerous did not easily take hold. Beyond eating, animal parts were also worn. Teeth, claws, bones, and skins were turned into charms. These objects were believed to provide ongoing protection. A tiger's tooth did not need to be eaten to be effective. Its presence near the body was enough. The strength of the animal was thought to radiate outward, forming a barrier against illness. These charms were often worn close to the chest or neck. Placement mattered. The heart area was considered especially vulnerable. Wearing a powerful animal part reinforced the belief that weakness could be blocked before it entered the body. Over time, these objects became family possessions passed down and reused. Their continued presence reinforced belief in their effectiveness. From a modern perspective, this practice appears symbolic rather than medical. Yet it fulfilled an important role. It gave meaning to illness. Weakness was not random. It was a loss of strength that could be replaced. Healing became an act of taking rather than waiting. The patient did not simply endure. They acted. There were moments when this approach coincided with actual benefit. Animal organs are rich in nutrients. Iron, vitamins, and proteins could temporarily improve energy and health. These improvements were attributed to spiritual absorption rather than nutrition. The explanation did not matter. The outcome reinforced belief. This accidental success allowed the practice to persist. It blended symbolism with physical effect in ways that were impossible to separate at the time. When a weak person recovered after eating liver, the conclusion was obvious. The animal's strength had entered them. No further explanation was needed. The dangers remained hidden until they were unavoidable. Parasites, foodborne illness, and contamination caused suffering and death. These outcomes were absorbed into the existing worldview. The animal might have been cursed. The spirit transfer might have gone wrong. The practice itself remained untouched. Eating organs also reinforced social hierarchy. Not everyone had access to these parts. The strongest animals were rare. The distribution of their organs reflected status, need, or authority. Healing was therefore tied to power within the group. Those with influence could secure stronger remedies. This method of healing shows how deeply intertwined belief and survival were. In a world without measurement or diagnosis, strength was observed, not quantified. The idea that it could be consumed made sense. It was visible, tangible, and immediate. The human body was not treated as separate from the natural world. It was porous. What entered it mattered. What touched it mattered. Healing was not a process of repair, but of replacement. Weakness left, strength entered. Over time, this way of thinking shaped how people responded to illness. When pain or fatigue appeared, the answer was not restraint. It was an acquisition. More strength was needed. Stronger animals were sought. Stronger charms were worn. The boundary between food, medicine, and ritual disappeared. This practice did not vanish quickly. Even as societies changed, the belief that strength could be absorbed endured. It would resurface in new forms long after the prehistoric world had faded. Here, healing meant consuming power rather than waiting for recovery. The bodies of animals became reservoirs of strength for those who felt it slipping away, and when belief focused on what could be taken into the body, other dangers remained unseen. Smoke was never treated as empty air in prehistoric life. It carried weight, smell, and direction. It rose, drifted, and lingered in ways that fire alone did not. Because it moved between spaces, smoke was believed to move between worlds. When illness appeared, especially illness that did not leave visible marks, smoke became a natural response. It could reach what hands could not. Sick individuals were often brought into enclosed spaces filled with smoke. Caves, huts, or low shelters were used to trap it. Fires were built deliberately with specific plants, leaves, or resins. The choice of material mattered. Some plants were associated with protection. Others were linked to ancestors or spirits believed to guard the group. The smoke was thick, sometimes overwhelming, and breathing it was unavoidable. The purpose was not comfort. Smoke stung, the eyes burned the throat, and made breathing difficult. These reactions were not interpreted as harm. They were taken as signs that the smoke was active. If the patient coughed or became dizzy, it was believed that the illness was being disturbed. The body's struggle was seen as proof that the treatment was working. Illness, caused by unseen forces, required an unseen response. Smoke filled this role. It could surround the body, enter the lungs, and pass over the skin. It left residue and smell, marking the patient as treated. When the smoke cleared, the hope was that whatever had caused the sickness would have fled with it. Herbal smoke was especially valued. Certain plants were burned repeatedly, generation after generation. Their continued use gave them authority. If a plant had been burned during a past recovery, it earned a reputation. That reputation mattered more than consistency. Healing did not need to work every time. It only needed to work sometimes. Some of these plants contained compounds that could mildly disinfect the air or reduce insects. Others caused sedation or altered awareness. These effects were not understood in physical terms, but they were noticed. A calmer patient after smoke exposure reinforced the belief. Relief, even temporary, was enough. The environment of the ritual intensified its impact. Darkness enclosed space, and heat amplified fear and expectation. The patient was not alone. Others watched, chanted, or remained silent. The collective attention focused on the sick body. This focus created pressure. Recovery became a shared outcome. Failure was shared as well. Smoke was also used as a boundary. By filling a space with smoke, healers created separation between the sick and the rest of the group. The illness was contained. The idea that disease could spread spiritually made this separation important. Smoke acted as both treatment and barrier. Children were subjected to these practices as well. A coughing child, or one with fever, was often believed to be especially vulnerable to harmful forces. Smoke was used to protect and cleanse. The child's distress was accepted. Crying meant the smoke was reaching deep enough. The duration of exposure varied. Some sessions were brief. Others lasted until the fire burned low or the patient collapsed from exhaustion. Ending the ritual too soon risked leaving the illness behind. Persistence mattered more than moderation. From a modern perspective, the risks are clear. Smoke inhalation irritates the lungs and can worsen respiratory conditions. Enclosed exposure reduces oxygen. For weakened individuals, this could be fatal. Yet death during or after the ritual did not condemn the practice. It confirmed the seriousness of the illness. Smoke also left visible traces. Hair, skin, and clothing absorbed its scent. This lingering smell acted as a sign that the person had been treated. It reassured others. The sickness had been addressed. Whether the patient recovered or not, action had been taken. The logic behind smoke healing rested on movement. Illness was believed to be restless. It entered, settled, and resisted removal. Smoke moved constantly. It filled every gap. It pushed, chased, and displaced. In this way, it felt like the opposite of sickness. The use of smoke reveals how prehistoric healing favored immersion over precision. The entire body was treated at once. There was no focus on specific organs or causes. The goal was saturation. If the illness was everywhere, the treatment should be everywhere too. This method also reinforced the authority of the healer. Knowing which plants to burn and how long to expose the patient required experience. These decisions were not questioned. The healer controlled the environment, the timing, and the interpretation of results. Occasionally, people did recover after smoke exposure. Whether from rest, placebo effect, or coincidence, these recoveries mattered. They became stories. Stories turned into rules. Rules turned into tradition. Smoke healing did not disappear quickly. Variations of it persisted long after writing, and medicine developed. The belief that smoke could cleanse, protect, or heal remained powerful. It was simple, visible, and dramatic. What makes this practice unsettling is its quiet logic. Smoke seemed gentle compared to cutting or burning flesh. Yet its effects were pervasive. It entered the body invisibly and left consequences that were not always immediate. Smoke blurred the line between healing and harm. It could calm or suffocate, cleanse or weaken. The difference was not always visible until it was too late. Here, healing meant surrounding the body with something that could reach what hands could not. Smoke promised cleansing by filling every space where illness might hide. Once breathing itself became part of treatment, the boundary between relief and danger grew thin. Poison occupied a strange position in prehistoric healing. It was feared, respected, and deliberately sought out at the same time. When sickness refused to leave the body, when weakness lingered despite bloodletting fire, or smoke poison was introduced as a final measure. This choice did not come from recklessness alone. It came from a belief that illness represented an imbalance so severe that only a force equally severe could correct it. Venom from snakes, sap from toxic plants, bitter roots, or crushed insects were gathered with care. These substances were known to kill. That knowledge was not hidden or ignored. It was central to their use. Poison was powerful precisely because it could end life. If illness was strong enough to threaten death, then death itself had to be brought close to challenge it. The body was treated as something that could be shocked back into order. When poison entered, violent reactions followed. Vomiting, convulsions, sweating, loss of control, and collapse were expected. These responses were not signs of failure. They were interpreted as evidence that the poison had reached deep enough. A calm body would have been alarming. A struggling body meant the sickness had been confronted. Dosage was based on experience rather than calculation. Healers relied on memory, instinct, and tradition. A plant that had been used before was used again. A venom that had once produced survival was trusted. The margin for error was narrow. Too little poison was dismissed as useless. Too much ended life. The space between those outcomes defined the healer's role. An external application was often preferred. Poison could be rubbed into cuts or small incisions. The skin acted as a controlled gateway. This method echoed earlier practices of bloodletting, though the intention differed. Bloodletting removed what was thought to be harmful. Poison was added deliberately. It forced the body into crisis. Ingestion was more feared. Swallowing poison meant surrendering control entirely. The substance entered the core of the body beyond reach. Vomiting afterward was seen as essential. What came up was believed to carry illness with it. If nothing came up, fear increased. Silence from the body suggested defeat. These practices framed healing as a test rather than a repair. The body was not gently supported. It was challenged. Endurance mattered more than comfort. Survival itself became the measure of success. A person who lived through poisoning was seen as having expelled the illness through sheer force. Occasionally, recovery did follow. Severe purging could remove parasites. Shock could alter the course of infection. These outcomes were not understood in biological terms, yet they were observed. When a person improved after poison exposure, belief hardened. Stories of survival spread quickly. Deaths remained quieter, absorbed into the expectation that not everyone could be saved. The role of the healer became more dangerous at this stage. Handling venomous animals or toxic plants placed them at risk. Their willingness to face this danger elevated their status. A healer who survived repeated contact with poison was believed to possess special protection or favor from unseen forces. This belief insulated them from blame. If a patient died, responsibility lay with fate or the illness itself. Children were sometimes subjected to poison therapy, though hesitation was common. A sick child created urgency. Other methods were tried first. Poison entered the picture only when nothing else seemed to work. When a child survived, the event became a powerful confirmation of the method. When a child died, grief followed. Yet the logic remained intact. The illness had been too strong. This approach reveals a harsh understanding of life. Survival was never guaranteed. Death was familiar. Poison therapy fit into a world where daily existence already involved constant risk. Introducing poison felt consistent with that reality. It was not seen as cruel. It was seen as decisive. From a modern perspective, the danger is obvious. Poison weakens already compromised bodies. It damages organs and overwhelms systems struggling to function. Yet, prehistoric people did not evaluate risk through comparison. They acted within a framework where action itself held value. Waiting felt passive. Poison created movement reaction and visible struggle. The psychological impact mattered. Poison therapy turned an invisible illness into a dramatic event. The group watched closely. The body's response became a shared experience. Recovery brought relief, not only for the patient, but for the belief system that supported the practice. Failure reinforced the seriousness of sickness, rather than undermining the method. Over time, this practice contributed to an escalation in healing responses. When gentler actions failed, stronger ones followed. Smoke led to poison. The pattern was consistent. Each step increased the risk in exchange for perceived effectiveness. Healing drifted further from care and closer to ordeal. Poison also reinforced ideas of worthiness. Those who survived were seen as strong, favored, or chosen. Survival was not random. It carried meaning. This interpretation helped communities cope with loss. Death was framed as an inevitability rather than a consequence. The use of poison in healing stands as a clear example of how desperation reshapes logic. It shows how easily harm can be redefined as help when options are limited. It shows how survival can become evidence of correctness regardless of cost. This method did not disappear quickly. Variations persisted long after other practices evolved. The belief that extreme danger could reset the body lingered in many forms. It was rooted here, in a time when healing meant confronting death directly. Here, healing became a deliberate confrontation with danger, rather than a search for relief. Poison forced the body into a violent reaction in the hope that sickness would retreat. When survival itself served as proof, the boundary between cure and harm dissolved. Cutting into the body was never taken lightly in prehistoric communities. Yet it was not avoided when injury or decay became impossible to ignore. When flesh turned dark, when wounds smelled wrong, or when swelling hardened instead of easing, the body was believed to be holding on to something that no longer belonged there. Dead tissue was not seen as part of the living person. It was a foreign matter that needed to be removed before it poisoned what remained. Stone and bone became the tools for this task. Sharp flakes of flint, obsidian, animal teeth, or carefully shaped bone edges were used to cut away damaged flesh. These tools were not crude in intention, even if they were simple in form. Their edges could be sharper than metal, capable of slicing cleanly through skin and muscle. What they lacked was control. Every cut carried uncertainty. The decision to operate usually came after other attempts had failed. Smoke, fire, bloodletting, or ritual had not stopped the worsening injury. At that point, leaving the body intact felt more dangerous than opening it. Infection did not have a name, but its signs were familiar. Fever, discoloration, spreading pain, and weakness signaled that the body was losing ground. Cutting became an act of last resistance. Pain was immediate and overwhelming. There was no anesthesia, no way to dull sensation beyond restraint and endurance. The patient was held down or braced against the ground. Screams were expected. Silence would have been unsettling. Pain meant the person was still alive and responsive. Loss of consciousness was dangerous, but sometimes unavoidable. The act itself required precision, learned through repetition. Healers did not understand anatomy as a system, yet they learned through observation. They knew where cuts caused rapid bleeding and where bleeding slowed. They learned which areas healed better than others. These lessons were paid for with suffering and death. Knowledge was carved into memory rather than written down. Removing dead tissue was believed to free the body from corruption. Dark flesh pus or foul smell confirmed that the cut was necessary. Watching this material leave the body gave the impression of progress. The worse the wound looked before cutting, the more justified the act appeared. Success was measured visually, not through long-term outcomes. After cutting, wounds were rarely closed in a controlled way. Sometimes they were left open to drain. Other times they were packed with plant matter, ash, or animal fat. These substances were chosen for symbolic or traditional reasons rather than cleanliness. They could slow bleeding or protect the wound from immediate exposure, yet they also introduced new risks. Infections followed frequently. Swelling returned. Fever rose. From a modern view, these signs indicate danger. From a prehistoric perspective, they could mean the body was still fighting. More cutting might be required. The line between treatment and escalation was thin. What makes this practice difficult to dismiss entirely is the evidence of survival. Skeletal remains show healed cut marks. Bone regrowth indicates that some individuals lived long enough for recovery to occur. These survivors validated the practice. Their existence mattered more than the many who did not survive. Stories of recovery traveled farther than quiet deaths. Sometimes the cut itself may have helped. Removing necrotic tissue can prevent further spread of infection. Draining abscesses can relieve pressure. These effects were not understood, yet they occurred. Coincidence and partial success reinforced belief. The method stayed. Children were not exempt. Injured or infected limbs in children posed serious threats to group survival. Cutting was used despite the risk. Smaller bodies bled faster and weakened sooner, yet death was not always attributed to the act. The injury or illness was blamed instead. The healer, performing these procedures, occupied a precarious position. They carried responsibility without protection. Their authority depended on reputation rather than certainty. Success elevated them. Failure did not necessarily destroy their role. Illness was unpredictable. Death did not imply error. These early surgeries reveal a willingness to intervene directly in the body when all else failed. They show that prehistoric healing was not passive or mystical alone. It involved physical invasion, judgment, and skill. The body became a site of decision rather than mystery. From a modern perspective, the lack of sanitation is horrifying. Dirty tools, bare hands, and contaminated materials made survival unlikely. Yet, within the prehistoric world, cleanliness had different meanings. Visible dirt mattered more than an invisible threat. If a tool looked clean enough, it was acceptable. Surgery with stone or bone blurred the boundary between healing and harm. Cutting could save or kill. There was no way to know which outcome would follow. The willingness to accept that uncertainty speaks to the desperation of the time. Doing nothing felt worse than risking everything. This practice also reinforced the belief that the body could be fixed through removal. If something was wrong, it could be cut away. This logic would echo through later healing methods. The idea that health could be restored by subtraction became deeply rooted. The scars left by these procedures tell a quiet story. They show hands willing to cut bodies, willing to endure, and communities willing to accept pain as the price of survival. They show a world where healing required courage rather than comfort. In the absence of understanding, action carried its own authority. Cutting was visible. It was decisive. It transformed illness into something tangible. Even when it failed, it felt meaningful. Here, healing meant cutting away what was feared to be poisoning the body. Sharp stone and bone turned injury into a visible struggle for survival. When flesh itself became the target, the body was no longer treated as a boundary to protect. Marks cut into skin carried meaning long before writing existed. In prehistoric communities, the body itself became a surface for memory, belief, and response to pain. When illness settled into joints or muscles and refused to leave, some people chose not to remove blood, burn flesh, or introduce poison. Instead, they altered the skin. Tattooing emerged as a quieter form of intervention, one that stayed with the body long after the pain had passed or deepened. Archaeological evidence offers small but striking clues. Certain skeletons show traces of inked lines positioned near damaged joints or areas of repeated strain. These markings were not decorative in the way later tattoos would become. They followed patterns. They appeared where pain had likely been severest. The placement suggests intention rather than coincidence. The skin above suffering was changed as part of the response to that suffering. Tattooing requires cutting or puncturing the skin repeatedly. Sharp tools, often stone or bone, were used to open tiny wounds. Pigments made from charcoal, ash, or plant matter were rubbed into the cuts. The process was slow and painful. There was no way to numb sensation. Each puncture was felt. Endurance mattered. The pain of tattooing was accepted as part of its effect. The logic behind this practice combined several beliefs. One held that marking the body could confuse or trap illness. If sickness moved invisibly through flesh, then changing the skin might interrupt its path. Another belief focused on attention. By injuring the skin, pain was redirected. The body's focus shifted. The deeper ache in joints or muscles might ease as sharper pain occupied the senses. Tattooing also acted as a signal. The mark announced that the body had been treated. It told others that action had been taken. This mattered in communal settings. Illness did not belong to one person alone. It threatened the group. A marked body showed that the sickness had been addressed whether or not improvement followed. Some marks may have served as reminders. Pain that came and went was difficult to predict. Tattooing fixed the experience in place. The mark remained even when the pain faded. It warned of vulnerability. It reminded the wearer and others of past weakness. This memory shaped future behavior, encouraging caution or ritual protection. There is also the possibility of a physical effect. Repeated puncturing of the skin can stimulate nerves and alter sensation. Modern parallels exist in techniques that relieve pain through controlled injury. Prehistoric people did not understand nerves as structures, yet they observed results. If pain eased after tattooing, the method gained credibility. Observation was enough. The combination of physical sensation and belief amplified the impact. Tattooing hurt and hurting felt active. The body responded. Swelling, warmth, and sensitivity followed. These reactions were interpreted as engagement. The body was doing something. Stillness was feared. Change, even painful change, suggested movement toward resolution. Tattooing required commitment. Once marked, the body could not return to its previous state. This permanence reinforced belief. A temporary ritual might fail quietly. A permanent mark demanded meaning. If the pain returned, the mark explained it. The illness had deeper roots. If pain faded, the mark became proof of success. The social role of tattooing mattered as well. Not everyone marked their body. Choosing to do so demonstrated seriousness. It showed willingness to endure pain for healing. This endurance earned respect. A marked individual had faced suffering directly. Their scars carried authority. Children were less commonly tattooed for healing, though not entirely excluded. Smaller bodies posed a greater risk. The pain and potential for infection made adults hesitate. Yet in cases of persistent suffering, the method was used. Infection was always possible. Pigments were not clean. Tools were reused. Swelling or fever could follow. These dangers were accepted as part of the process. From a modern perspective, tattooing as treatment appears symbolic rather than effective. Yet symbolism mattered deeply. Healing did not rely solely on physical change. It relied on belief, expectation, and response. Tattooing engaged all three. The body was altered. The mind anticipated improvement. The community recognized the action. Tattooing also bridged spiritual and physical approaches. Unlike bloodletting or cutting, it did not remove or destroy tissue. Unlike poison, it did not overwhelm the body. It was modified rather than attacked. This moderation may explain its persistence. It offered control without an immediate threat to life. The marks themselves often followed simple patterns. Lines, dots, or crosses appeared repeatedly across cultures. Complexity was not required. Meaning came from placement and intention. The design mattered less than the act. These practices reveal an early understanding that the body could be influenced through sensation and symbol together. Pain was not only something to endure, it was something to use. Tattooing turned pain into a tool rather than an enemy. Over time, such marks accumulated. A body could carry multiple signs of past suffering. These signs told stories without words. They recorded illness, survival, and belief in skin and bone. The unsettling aspect of tattoo healing lies in its subtlety. Compared to cutting or burning, it seems restrained. Yet it still involved deliberate injury. It is still an accepted risk. It still relied on the idea that pain could produce healing. Tattooing shows that prehistoric healing was not always about escalation. Sometimes It was about persistence. Marking the body meant staying with the illness rather than forcing it out. The sickness was acknowledged and contained rather than expelled. This approach would echo through later practices. The idea that marking, pressing, or puncturing the skin could influence deeper pain did not disappear. It evolved, changed form, and gained new explanations. Here, healing meant altering the skin to influence pain beneath it. Permanent marks turned suffering into something visible, remembered, and acknowledged. Once the body itself became a record of illness, recovery no longer erased the experience. Movement became medicine in prehistoric healing, when pain refused to respond to cutting, burning, or marking the body. Illness that lingered without clear wounds or visible damage was often interpreted as restless. It moved through the person unsettled and unseen. In response, healing itself began to move. Ritual dancing emerged as a way to confront sickness through sound, rhythm, and motion rather than direct injury. The shaman stood at the center of these ceremonies. Their body became the instruments through which healing was attempted. Dancing around the sick person, they stamped the ground, spun in circles, and shifted posture repeatedly. These movements were not improvised. They followed patterns learned through repetition. Each step carried meaning. Each gesture echoed something believed to exist beyond the visible world. Sound played an equal role. Drums were struck in steady rhythms. Bells were shaken near the body. Rattles made from bone shell or dried seed were moved close to the patient's ears. The noise was deliberate and often overwhelming. Silence was avoided. Sound filled the space the way smoke once had. It surrounded the sick person and left little room for stillness. Shouting and chanting accompanied the movement. Words were spoken loudly, sometimes harshly. The shaman's voice rose and fell, breaking the quiet that illness often imposed. These sounds were not meant to comfort. They were meant to confront. Illness was believed to be an intruder, something that needed to be startled or driven away. The patient's role was passive. They lay or sat while the ritual unfolded around them, attention focused entirely on their body. Every movement of the shaman circled back to the sick person. This concentration mattered. It created pressure. The illness was no longer hidden. It was being addressed publicly and intensely. The psychological effect of these rituals was powerful. Fear, expectation, and exhaustion mixed. The patient's breathing changed. Muscles are tensed or relaxed in response to sound and motion. In cases where illness was mild or temporary, these changes could coincide with recovery. Relief followed. The ritual earned credit. Observers remembered these successes. A person who stood after a night of dancing became proof. The memory of improvement overshadowed failures. When a patient did not recover, the explanation was never that the ritual lacked value. The illness had been too strong. The spirits had refused to leave. Ritual dancing also served the wider group. It reassured everyone present that something was being done. Illness created anxiety beyond the individual. It threatened food gathering, safety, and continuity. Watching a shaman perform gave structure to fear. Action replaced waiting. The physical toll on the shaman was significant. Hours of movement drained energy. Repetition strains muscles. Breath grew heavy. Sweat soaked clothing or skin. This visible effort reinforced authority. Healing required sacrifice. A healer who was visibly tired was believed to be fighting alongside the patient. These rituals could last for long periods. They continued until the shaman collapsed, the fire burned low, or the patient showed some change. Ending too early risked failure. Persistence mattered. Exhaustion was accepted as necessary. Children were included in these ceremonies. A sick child drew attention and urgency. The shaman's movements tightened. Sounds grew sharper. The hope was that intensity could compensate for vulnerability. When a child recovered, belief strengthened deeply. When a child died, grief followed, yet doubt rarely entered. From a modern perspective, the effects of these rituals are easier to understand. Rhythmic sound can alter mental states. Movement and focus can reduce anxiety. Placebo effects can ease symptoms. None of this was known in prehistoric times. What mattered was observation. Some people improved. That was enough. Ritual dancing avoided direct harm to the body. Unlike cutting or burning, it left no immediate wounds. This made it appealing when physical methods seemed too dangerous. It offered intervention without invasion. Pain existed, yet it belonged to the shaman more than the patient. This method also reinforced social hierarchy. Not everyone could perform these dances. Knowledge of rhythm, movement, and ritual belonged to a few. Their control over healing strengthened their position. Healing became a performance of authority as much as a response to illness. The environment shaped the ritual's effect. Firelight flickered. Shadows moved with the dancer. Smoke and sound blended. The boundary between the physical world and the unseen felt thin. In this atmosphere, belief deepened. The body's reactions were interpreted through expectation rather than analysis. Ritual dancing reflects a shift in healing approach. Instead of attacking the body, it targeted perception and belief. Illness was confronted through overwhelming sensation rather than physical intervention. This shift did not replace other methods. It existed alongside them, chosen when appropriate. What makes this practice unsettling is its effectiveness in the absence of understanding. Relief that followed ritual reinforced belief, even when coincidence played a role. The human mind filled gaps where knowledge did not exist. Healing became something that could be summoned through effort and display. These ceremonies left no marks on bone, yet their impact shaped behavior. They taught communities that healing did not always require injury. Movement, sound, and attention could matter. This lesson would persist long after prehistoric times ended. Ritual dancing blurred the line between healing and performance. It turned illness into an event. It demanded witnesses. It transformed private suffering into communal action. This transformation gave meaning to pain. The method also reveals a deep fear of stillness. The illness that lingered quietly was frightening. Movement countered that fear. As long as something moved, something could change. Here, healing relied on motion, sound, and exhaustion rather than physical injury. Ritual dancing turned sickness into something confronted through presence and intensity. As belief became tied to performance, recovery grew inseparable from expectation. Covering wounds with animal dung was not considered careless in prehistoric healing. It was understood as a practical response to danger. When the skin split open and blood appeared, the body was seen as exposed. An open wound was more than damaged flesh. It was an opening through which sickness, spirits, or decay could enter. The priority was not cleanliness in the modern sense, but closure. The wound had to be sealed quickly. Dung from large animals such as cattle or horses was commonly used. These animals were familiar, strong, and essential to daily survival. Their bodies endured long labor, harsh weather, and injury. That endurance mattered. Anything produced by such animals was believed to carry traces of their strength. Fresh dung was warm to the touch, and warmth held deep significance. Cold was associated with weakness and death. Warmth suggested life continuing. Applying dung was a direct act. It required no preparation. It was pressed onto the wound by hand, sometimes layered thickly, sometimes shaped to fit the injury. Speed mattered. Blood loss frightened communities, especially when injuries occurred far from shelter. Dung could be applied immediately, slowing bleeding by pressure and absorption. This visible effect reinforced belief in its usefulness. Smell played an important role. Strong odors were not avoided. They were valued. A powerful smell filled the space and demanded attention. Illness, often imagined as an unseen presence, was thought to retreat from overwhelming environments. The sharp, heavy odor of dung was believed to drive harmful forces away. A wound that smelled strongly was considered guarded rather than contaminated. The texture of dung mattered as well. It was thick, dense, and moldable. It could form a crude barrier covering exposed tissue and protecting it from insects or debris. Once applied, the wound was no longer visible. This concealment provided reassurance. Seeing open flesh caused fear. Covering it restored a sense of control. From a modern perspective, the risks are severe. Animal dung contains bacteria, parasites, and waste products that easily infect wounds. In prehistoric times, invisible dangers were less concerning than visible ones. Dirt was expected. Infection was not recognized as a separate process. Only when wounds turned black, swelled severely, or produced a strong odor was danger acknowledged. By then, treatment often escalated rather than stopped. Sometimes this method appeared to work. Dung dried and hardened, forming a crude scab. Bleeding slowed. In rare cases, wounds healed despite contamination. These outcomes mattered. Survivors validated the practice. Deaths were attributed to the severity of injury, not the substance applied. Children were frequently treated this way. Cuts, scrapes, and falls were common. Dung offered a fast solution when panic set in. The discomfort caused by smell or sensation was secondary. Stopping blood mattered more than easing pain. If a child survived, the method gained trust. If a child died, grief followed without questioning the act itself. Dung was also applied to swollen areas, insect bites, or irritated skin. The warmth and pressure brought temporary relief. Temporary relief was enough. Healing did not require permanence to be believed effective. Short-lived improvement justified repetition. This practice reveals how prehistoric healing relied on sensory authority. What could be felt, smelled, and seen carried more weight than what could not. Warmth felt protective. Strong odor felt active. A covered wound felt safe. These sensations guided belief more than long-term outcomes. The closeness between humans and animals made this practice possible. Animal waste was part of daily life. It was not treated with disgust. Familiarity removed fear. What modern societies reject instinctively, prehistoric communities accepted without hesitation. Healers who recommended this method were rarely blamed for poor outcomes. Injury and death were common regardless of treatment. Applying dung fits within an accepted range of responses. It was better to act than to wait. Action itself carried value. From a modern viewpoint, this method is disturbing because it contradicts ideas of hygiene. Yet prehistoric concepts of purity were different. Cleanliness was not about removing microorganisms. It was about restoring balance and protection. A sealed wound was preferable to an open one regardless of what sealed it. Availability shaped belief strongly. Dung was always present. It required no ritual preparation, no negotiation with spirits, no specialized tools. In moments of urgency, simplicity mattered. Healing relied on what could be reached immediately. This practice also blurred boundaries between waste and medicine. The same substance that marked the end of digestion became a means of preservation. Life and decay existed close together. Healing borrowed from both without contradiction. The psychological effect cannot be ignored. Applying something tangible to a wound reduced fear. It looked decisive. It reassured both patient and observers. The wound had been addressed. That reassurance mattered as much as the physical outcome. Over time, this method persisted because it fit its environment. It required no knowledge beyond availability. It aligned with beliefs about warmth, smell, and sealing. Even as other practices evolved, this one remained. What makes this method unsettling is its quiet logic. It did not involve spectacle or ritual intensity. It was ordinary. It happened without drama. Its danger lay in familiarity rather than extremity. This approach shows how healing often prioritizes immediate protection over long-term safety. The wound was closed. Fear eased. Danger continued unseen. The body carried the cost quietly. Here, healing meant sealing injured flesh with what lay closest at hand. Warmth and overpowering smell were trusted to shield wounds from invisible threats. When closure took priority over cleanliness, harm settled beneath a sense of safety. Water held a quiet authority in prehistoric healing. It moved constantly, carved stone, nourished plants, and sustained life without effort. When illness lingered without visible wounds, people looked toward water as something untouched by human failure. Springs in particular drew attention. Water emerging from the ground seemed to come from somewhere deeper and older than the surface world. That origin mattered. What rose from hidden places was believed to carry power. Certain springs gained reputations over time. Someone drank from one and recovered. Another bathed there and felt relief. These moments were remembered, stories formed. Repetition turned coincidence into belief. A spring that appeared to help once became sacred. Its water was no longer ordinary. It was set apart from rivers, rain, or wells. It belonged to a different category entirely. Illness was often interpreted as dryness, stagnation, or blockage. Water promised movement. Drinking spring water felt like restoring flow inside the body. Where pain felt stuck, water could pass through. Where weakness lingered, water could refresh. The simplicity of this idea made it powerful. No cutting, burning, or poisoning was required. Healing entered quietly. Ritual developed around these springs. People did not simply drink. They approached with care. Certain times were favored. Dawn, dusk, or specific phases of the moon mattered. Silence was sometimes required. In other cases, words were spoken softly. The act of drinking became deliberate. Attention focused on the water and its path into the body. Bathing followed. Sick individuals were led into pools fed by springs. Water touched skin slowly. Cold shocked the body awake. Warmth, where present, relaxed tense muscles. Immersion was believed to cleanse both flesh and spirit. What clung to the body could be washed away. This washing was not hurried. Time spent mattered. These bathing rituals also created separation. The sick were removed from daily spaces. They entered places associated with healing. This change of environment alone could alter perception. Rest, quiet, and expectation combined. The improvement that followed was attributed to the water rather than circumstances. Some springs contained minerals. Iron, sulfur, or salts alter taste and smell. These qualities reinforced belief. Water that tasted strange felt active. Smell suggested presence. If the body reacted through warmth, tingling, or discomfort, the reaction was welcomed. It meant the water was doing something. From a modern perspective, these minerals sometimes did offer benefits. Iron-rich water could help with anemia. Warm springs eased joint pain. Clear flowing water reduced exposure to contaminants found elsewhere. These effects were accidental rather than understood, yet they mattered. Recovery followed often enough to sustain belief. Danger existed as well. Not all springs were clean. Some carried parasites or toxins. Bathing weakened bodies in cold water. Drinking unfamiliar water caused illness. When harm followed, explanation shifted. The water had been offended. The ritual had been done incorrectly. The illness had been too strong. Children were brought to the springs frequently. A sick child inspired urgency. Water felt gentle compared to other methods. Parents trusted it. Watching a child bathe or drink felt caring rather than violent. When recovery occurred, belief deepened. When death followed, grief settled, without blame placed on the water. The social role of sacred springs expanded. They became gathering places. Shared belief strengthened the community. Healing was no longer private. It unfolded in public spaces, shaped by tradition. People watched others heal or fail. These observations built collective memory. Springs also offered something rare in prehistoric life: consistency. A spring flowed predictably. Fire could die. Plants could disappear. Animals moved away. Water returned, again and again. This reliability fostered trust. Something constant felt safe. The idea of sacred water bridged spiritual and physical understanding. Spirits were believed to dwell near springs. Ancestors were thought to watch over them. At the same time, the water touched the body directly. Healing did not require interpretation alone. It involved sensation. Coolness, taste, and pressure against skin are all reinforced experiences. The absence of immediate pain made this method appealing. Compared to cutting or burning water, healing felt restrained. It allowed hope without fear. This gentleness did not make it less serious. Ritual attention elevated it. Quiet carried weight. Over time, reliance on sacred springs shaped how people understood illness. Sickness became something that could be washed away rather than fought. This view softened healing responses. It offered an alternative to escalation. When other methods harmed visibly, water promised renewal. This practice persisted across cultures and eras. Even as tools improved, belief in healing waters remained. The idea that water from certain places could restore health proved difficult to abandon. It appealed to senses, belief, and observation equally. What makes this practice unsettling lies in its familiarity. Drinking water feels harmless. Bathing feels safe. The danger was subtle. Contamination, exposure, and false hope worked quietly. Harm arrived without spectacle. Sacred springs reveal how healing sometimes relied on patience rather than force. The body was given time. The mind was given belief. Improvement could follow naturally. Failure could be explained spiritually. The system sustained itself. In prehistoric healing, water represented renewal without violence. It carried the promise of change without damage. That promise mattered deeply in a world where suffering was constant. Here, healing rested on trust in movement and renewal rather than confrontation. Sacred water offered quiet hope through touch, taste, and immersion. With belief flowing easily, unseen danger traveled just as smoothly. Bones defined movement, labor, and survival in prehistoric life. When a joint slipped or a limb broke, the body's usefulness changed instantly. Walking, carrying, hunting, or even standing became difficult or impossible. Injury threatened not only the individual, but the group that depended on their strength. Faced with this risk, prehistoric communities turned to hands rather than tools. Manual bone setting became a direct response to visible damage. Dislocated joints were easier to recognize than internal illness. A limb bent the wrong way, refused to move, or caused sharp pain with the slightest motion. Broken bones swelled, darkened, and distorted. These signs demanded action. Leaving a limb misaligned meant permanent weakness. Rest alone felt insufficient. The body needed to be forced back into order. Bone setting relied entirely on touch. There were no splints designed to correct alignment, no imaging to confirm position. Healers used their eyes and hands. They compared injured limbs to uninjured ones. They felt for unevenness. They listened to the patient's reaction. Pain guided the process. Where pain intensified, something was wrong. Where it eased, alignment was assumed. The act itself was brutal. A healer gripped the injured limb, firmly braced their own body and applied force. Pulling, twisting, or sudden pressure followed. The sound of bones shifting or joints snapping back into place was sometimes heard. That sound carried meaning. It suggested success. Screams were expected. Silence would have been alarming. There was no anesthesia. Pain was endured fully. The patient's ability to withstand suffering influenced the outcome. Resistance could interfere with alignment. Others often restrained the injured person to prevent movement. This restraint was not viewed as cruel. It was a necessity. Precision mattered more than comfort. Once the bone or joint appeared to be set, the limb was immobilized using what was available. Wooden sticks, animal hides, plant fibers, or woven materials served as bindings. These supports were crude and often uncomfortable. They restricted movement unevenly. Pressure sores and circulation problems followed, yet immobilization itself felt protective. Stillness suggested healing. Cleanliness was not part of the process. Hands touched soil, animal matter, and wounds without separation. Broken skin around fractures invites infection. Swelling and fever followed frequently. These outcomes were not clearly linked to contamination. They were seen as part of the injury, rather than a consequence of treatment. Experience mattered more than explanation. Some individuals gained reputations for setting bones successfully. Their authority came from observation. A person who walked again after injury validated the healer's method. Failures were absorbed into expectation. Not every injury can be fixed. That limitation did not undermine belief. Children were treated this way as well. A broken limb in a child was terrifying. Growth depended on proper alignment. Bone setting felt urgent. Smaller bones were easier to manipulate, though children screamed and struggled. Their suffering did not stop the process. The risk of lifelong disability outweighed immediate pain. The success of manual bone setting varied widely. Some fractures healed surprisingly well. Bone has a natural capacity to repair. Proper alignment aided that process, even without understanding how. These recoveries reinforced belief. Other injuries healed poorly, leaving deformity or chronic pain. These outcomes were accepted as fate. This practice highlights a key aspect of prehistoric healing. Visible damage invited direct correction. Unlike illness explained through spirits, bone injury was tangible. Hands could feel the problem, force could address it. Healing shifted from negotiation with unseen forces to mechanical intervention. Yet belief still shaped interpretation. A healer's confidence mattered. Words spoken during the act reassured observers. Ritual gestures sometimes accompanied the manipulation. Even physical healing remained tied to expectation and meaning. From a modern perspective, the danger is clear. Forcing bones without imaging risks further damage. Infection threatens life. Nerve injury can cause permanent loss of function. Prehistoric healers did not evaluate these risks as we do. They balanced visible harm against visible necessity. A limb out of place demanded correction. Manual bone setting required courage on both sides. The healer risked blame if the patient worsened. The patient risked unbearable pain. This shared risk created trust. Healing became a collective act, witnessed and supported by others. This method persisted because it aligned with observation. A bone out of place could be felt. Putting it back felt logical. Even today, the basic principle remains, though refined by knowledge and tools. Its prehistoric form reveals how early humans responded to physical damage with direct action rather than abstraction. Bone setting also reinforced the idea that the body could be corrected through force. If something was wrong, pressure could fix it. This belief influenced other practices. It encouraged intervention over patience. What makes this practice unsettling is not its intent but its cost. Pain was unavoidable, infection was likely, survival was uncertain, yet doing nothing felt worse. A damaged body left untouched promised long-term suffering. Manual bone setting stands as one of the clearest examples of pragmatic prehistoric healing. It relied on observation, repetition, and endurance. It accepted pain as necessary. It aimed to restore function rather than comfort. The scars left by these practices remain visible in skeletal remains. Bones healed crookedly. Joints fused imperfectly. These marks tell stories of hands forcing alignment, of bodies resisting and enduring. In a world without medicine, the body became both problem and solution. Hands learned what they could do. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next, shaped by success and loss. Here healing depended on force, guided by experience rather than understanding. Hands replaced instruments, pain replaced anesthesia, and endurance replaced certainty. Alignment treated as a victory, left lasting damage unseen. Smell carried meaning long before it carried explanation. In prehistoric life, scent was one of the most immediate ways the world announced itself. Fire was smelled before it was seen. Rot was detected before it was touched. Animals were sensed through the air long before they appeared. When illness emerged without visible wounds or broken bones, people turned instinctively towards smell. It reached places hands could not, and it did so without opening the body. Healing through scent grew from this quiet authority. Plants with strong odors were gathered intentionally. Leaves, bark, resins, seeds, and roots were selected not for beauty but for presence. Some scents were sharp and biting, others heavy and earthy, others sweet and calming. These differences mattered deeply. The smell was not neutral. Each scent was believed to carry a message. In this belief system, odor functioned like language. Illness listened, spirits listened, the body listened. Burning herbs was one of the earliest methods. Plants were placed on embers, so they smoldered rather than flared. Thick flames were avoided. Smoke had already been used to overwhelm sickness. Scented smoke served a different purpose. It moved slowly and stayed close. Breathing it felt deliberate. The air changed, and that change marked the moment as healing. The sick person was often placed near the source of scent. Smoke drifted across their face and chest. Breathing slowed or deepened. Eyes watered. These reactions were watched carefully. Any change mattered. Calm suggested acceptance. Restlessness suggested resistance. The body's response guided interpretation. Wearing scent extended this effect. Bundles of herbs were tied together and hung from the neck or waist. Some were sewn into clothing. Others were worn directly against the skin. Placement followed belief. Near the head, protected thought. Near the chest, the guarded breath. Near the abdomen, strengthened inner life. These placements were repeated across generations, gaining authority through habit. Scent was also applied directly to the body. Crushed leaves were rubbed onto the skin. Oils infused with aromatic plants were spread along limbs or joints. The smell lingered close, forming a personal barrier. Illness was believed to approach silently. A constant scent announced protection. The idea that smell spoke to the soul shaped every step. Pleasant scents were thought to soothe offended spirits. Sharp scents were believed to drive them away. Heavy scents grounded wandering forces. There was no contradiction. Different illnesses required different messages. Selecting the right smell mattered more than understanding why. Some plants used in these practices had real effects on the nervous system. Certain scents calmed anxiety, others increased alertness. Relief followed often enough to sustain belief. The explanation remained spiritual, but observation reinforced tradition. When breathing eased or sleep came more easily, scent was credited. This method appealed because it avoided visible harm. No blood was spilled, no bones were forced, no skin was burned. Healing felt gentle. It resembled care rather than struggle. In a world filled with pain, this gentleness mattered. Children were treated with scent frequently. A sick child inspired fear and protectiveness. Burning herbs near sleeping spaces felt safer than cutting or burning flesh. Parents watched for calmer breathing or longer sleep. Even a brief improvement strengthened trust in the method. Scent-based healing also blended easily into daily life. Fires were already present. Herbs grew nearby. Wearing plant bundles did not interrupt the routine. Healing did not require special moments. It became continuous. Illness was addressed quietly without spectacle. From a modern perspective, this approach appears less dangerous than others. yet risk remained. Smoke irritates the lungs. Some plants were toxic. Prolonged exposure caused dizziness, nausea, or confusion. These effects were not clearly separated from healing responses. Discomfort could be interpreted as sickness leaving the body. The psychological impact was strong. Smell is deeply tied to memory and emotion. Exposure changed mood and perception. A calmer patient felt improved. Feeling improved suggested recovery. Expectation shaped experience. Experience reinforced belief. Healers who specialized in scent held subtle authority. Their knowledge lay in selection and balance rather than force. They knew which plants to combine and which to avoid. This expertise earned trust. Healing became quiet guidance rather than dramatic intervention. The belief that smell communicated with unseen forces reveals how prehistoric people understood interaction. Writing did not exist. Words were limited. Smell traveled freely. It crossed boundaries. It entered the body without resistance. This reach made it powerful. Scent healing also reinforced the idea that illness could be influenced without contact. Sickness was sensitive, capable of reaction. This belief softened healing responses. Not every illness demanded violence. Some could be persuaded, yet reliance on scent could delay stronger action. Severe illness treated gently risked worsening. Waiting for smell to persuade sickness away sometimes costs lives. These losses were absorbed into belief rather than used to challenge it. Over time, certain scents became closely associated with healing. Their repeated use turned them into symbols. Communities recognized each other by the plants they burned or wore. Healing became part of identity. This practice shows how healing is adapted to human senses. Sight and touch dominated earlier methods. Smell offered another path. It reached inward without breaking skin. It allowed care without confrontation. The unsettling aspect lies in its subtlety. Harm arrived quietly. Relief felt gentle. Danger hid behind comfort. Smell lulled rather than warned. Healing through scent reflects a desire to soothe rather than force. It trusted persuasion over pressure. It relied on belief, reinforced by sensation. The body, surrounded by odor, became a space of negotiation. Illness was addressed indirectly. Success depended on patience and interpretation. Here, healing relied on air and sensation rather than force. Scent promised communication with what could not be seen or touched. Gentle comfort allowed hidden danger to linger without challenge. Sacrifice entered prehistoric healing at the point where all other attempts had lost their authority. When smoke failed to calm the sick, when fire no longer closed wounds, when bloodletting weakened the body without relief, some communities turned toward an act that shifted healing away from medicine entirely. Illness was no longer treated as something to remove, redirect, or persuade. It became a sign of broken order. Healing changed into repayment. Within this worldview, sickness did not arise randomly. It carried intention. Spirits, ancestors, or unseen powers were believed to send illness as a warning or punishment. Pain meant imbalance. Death meant refusal to listen. When rituals, offerings, and bodily treatments failed, belief demanded escalation. Something of greater value had to be given. Nothing carried more weight than human life. The logic behind sacrifice was structured rather than chaotic. The community did not act in panic alone. Decisions followed tradition, memory, and interpretation. Elders recalled earlier times of crisis. Healers spoke of offended forces. Signs were read in dreams, weather, or repeated misfortune. Sacrifice emerged as a final response, shaped by meaning rather than impulse. The individual chosen was rarely random. Sometimes the sick person was selected. Their body had already been claimed by illness, offering them to complete a process already begun. Death, in this sense, was framed as release rather than loss. The illness ended the life. Balance was restored through closure. In other cases, a relative or symbolic substitute was offered instead. This choice carried deep significance. A healthy body given in place of a sick one demonstrated devotion and seriousness. The family accepted the loss to restore harmony. The act proved willingness to suffer so others might be spared. Healing moved from the individual to the collective. Blood stood at the center of these acts. It was visible, warm, and unmistakably alive. Blood spilled intentionally held meaning beyond violence. It carried apology, acknowledgement, and surrender. Words could fail. Blood did not. Its presence was believed to reach places voices could not. Ritual structure surrounded the act. Location mattered. Certain sites were believed to sit closer to unseen realms. Elevated groundwater, edges, caves, or marked clearings were favored. Time mattered. Specific moments held greater power. The act itself followed prescribed steps. Silence, chanting, or rhythmic sound framed the moment. Witnesses were present. Healing, even at this extreme, remained communal. Grief did not negate belief. It reinforced it. Tears proved sincerity. Pain demonstrated commitment. The suffering of those left behind became part of the offering. Healing is no longer focused on comfort. It focused on restoring order regardless of cost. Children were sometimes involved, which reveals the harshness of this worldview. A sick child represented vulnerability and future loss. When illness threatened, survival fear intensified. Sacrifice could involve the child or another offered in their place. The logic remained consistent. Survival of the group outweighed individual life. From a modern perspective, such acts appear as cruelty without purpose. Within their context, they represented the final action. Waiting was no longer acceptable. Doing nothing risked continued suffering or collective punishment. Sacrifice ended uncertainty. The gods had been answered. Whatever followed could be endured. Evidence of these practices appears unevenly across cultures. Not every society practiced human sacrifice. Where it existed, it often appeared during periods of crisis. Epidemics, repeated deaths, or unexplained misfortune created conditions where belief hardened. Extreme illness demanded an extreme response. Authority played a crucial role. Leaders, elders, or shamans sanctioned the act. Responsibility was shared. No single person carried blame. This diffusion of responsibility allowed the practice to persist. Doubt had little space to grow. Sacrifice reframed healing entirely. The goal was no longer to save the sick individual. It became the protection of the living. Health shifted from personal condition to communal state. One life could be lost, so others might continue. This calculation defined survival in a fragile world. The psychological effect was powerful. Fear transformed into ritual action. Chaos gained structure. Even if illness continued, belief adjusted. The offering had been given. Further suffering became destiny rather than failure. This practice also reinforced social order. Who could be sacrificed and who could not reflected hierarchy and symbolism. Sacrifice communicated values. It revealed how survival was prioritized and whose lives carried different meanings. The unsettling nature of this method lies in its internal logic. It followed the belief to its conclusion. If illness was a message, a response was required. If lesser offerings failed, greater ones followed. The system did not question itself. It escalated. Sacrifice marks the limit of prehistoric healing. It shows the point where the body ceased to be treated as something to repair. Healing moved outward into a relationship with unseen forces. Medicine became negotiation through loss. The memory of such acts lingered. Stories warned future generations. Illness inspired fear, not only of death, but of consequence. Healing carried moral weight. Sickness demanded reckoning. This method never defined everyday healing, yet its presence casts a long shadow. It shows how desperation reshapes ethics. It shows how belief can justify irreversible action. It shows how survival sometimes demanded acceptance of loss rather than hope of recovery. Sacrifice stands as a boundary. Beyond it, healing no longer aimed at saving the body. It aimed at appeasing forces believed to control fate. Here, healing crossed from intervention into surrender. Human blood became a message sent where words no longer reached. The belief that demanded payment left little room for mercy. Objects carried meaning long before they carried explanation. In prehistoric communities, illness was rarely understood as something happening only inside the body. Disease was imagined as something that moved, watched, followed, or waited for weakness. Because of this, protection mattered as much as treatment. Wearing objects believed to repel sickness became one of the most enduring responses to fear, uncertainty, and helplessness. Amulets took many forms depending on the environment and culture. Teeth from predators, claws, horns, smooth stones found near rivers, shells washed ashore, carved bones, or strangely shaped pieces of wood were all used. These objects were never chosen randomly. Each one carried a story. A tooth from a strong animal symbolized dominance and survival. A claw represented the ability to hold on. A stone shaped slowly by water suggested endurance across time. Objects that survived harsh conditions were believed capable of passing that endurance to the human body. Placement on the body followed belief rather than anatomy. Amulets were worn near the chest to guard the heart and breath, near the throat to protect voice, and life force around the waist to secure vitality, or tied to limbs to preserve movement. Illness was thought to attack these areas first. Protection followed fear, not logic. These objects were rarely new. Many were inherited across generations, passed from parent to child, or from elder to youth. They accumulated meaning through survival. An amulet worn by someone who lived through sickness gained authority. If that person survived war, injury, or hunger, the object became proof. Its power did not come from material, but from memory. Each survival layered belief onto the object until it became inseparable from hope. Wearing an amulet changed behavior in subtle ways. The wearer felt guarded. Fear softened slightly. Breathing slowed. Rest came more easily. This shift mattered. Reduced fear altered posture, sleep, and endurance. When improvement followed, even coincidentally, the object received credit. Belief reinforced itself quietly. Stones held particular importance. Smooth stones taken from rivers or springs were favored because water symbolized movement and renewal. Stones with unusual colors, holes, or shapes attracted attention. Rarity suggested intention. These stones were rubbed during moments of fear, held during sleep, or pressed against the body when pain intensified. Their weight provided reassurance. The sensation itself became part of healing. Animal parts carried a different symbolism. Teeth, claws, horns, and bones represented power taken from another life. Wearing them was believed to borrow that strength. Illness, imagined as a weak intruder, could be intimidated. Protection through dominance felt natural in a world where survival depended on force and endurance. These objects were not passive. They were touched, spoken to, and acknowledged. During moments of illness, wearers held their amulets while resting or during rituals. Interaction deepened belief. The object became a companion rather than a decoration. Responsibility for survival was shared between body and charm. Children wore amulets frequently. Infant illness terrified communities. A small object tied near a child's neck, wrist, or ankle felt protective. Parents trusted these items deeply. When children survived, common sickness belief hardened. When children died, the object was rarely blamed. Fate, spirits, or stronger forces were invoked instead. The amulet remained innocent. Amulets also provided continuity. In a world where healing methods shifted depending on injury or illness, these objects stayed constant. Fire, smoke cutting, or ritual might come and go. An amulet stayed with the body. This permanence mattered. Something always present felt reliable. From a modern perspective, these objects have no direct medical effect, yet their psychological impact is undeniable. Hope influences perception. Feeling protected reduces stress. Reduced stress supports recovery. These effects were not understood scientifically, yet they were observed through experience. Observation was enough. Danger existed quietly. Some objects carried dirt, bacteria, or sharp edges. Worn close to wounds, they could worsen infection. Heavy objects strained weak bodies. These risks were invisible. When harm followed, belief adapted. The illness was stronger than the protection. The object had delayed harm rather than prevented it. The power of amulets lies entirely in meaning. A stone was only a stone until belief transformed it. That belief was shared socially. Everyone recognized the object's significance. Collective belief amplified individual hope. Healing became communal, even when worn privately. Healers often distributed or approved these objects. Their authority extended beyond ceremonies. Selecting the correct charm mattered. Their judgment reinforced hierarchy. Healing was not only performed, it was carried. Amulets blurred the boundary between healing and identity. Wearing certain objects signaled belonging, lineage, and belief. Healing merged with culture. The body became a display of protection rather than vulnerability. This practice reflects a deep desire for control. Illness felt unpredictable and threatening. An amulet offered constant agency. Protection did not depend on timing or strength. It was always present. That presence eased fear. The unsettling aspect of this method lies in its quiet reassurance. It felt safe. It felt gentle. Danger waited patiently beneath trust. Reliance on objects sometimes delayed action when illness worsened. Hope replaced urgency. Yet these objects endured because they answered emotional needs. They transformed fear into something holdable. They gave shape to protection. They allowed belief to rest on the body itself. Amulets show how healing expanded beyond action into possession. Health became something one could wear. Survival became something one could touch. The boundary between body and belief disappeared. The body, marked by charms and objects, became a moving threshold. Illness might approach, yet something stood between it and flesh. That belief carried people through fear, pain, and uncertainty. Here, healing depended on a belief carried close to the body. Objects turned hope into something tangible and constant. Protection worn daily allowed danger to wait quietly beside trust. Hair carried meaning far beyond appearance in prehistoric life. It grew silently, changed slowly, and followed a person everywhere. When illness lingered for weeks or months without clear wounds or breaks, attention often shifted away from blood, bone, or breath, and toward what remained constantly present. Hair became suspect. It was believed to trap what could not be seen, to hold on to sickness, in the same way it held smoke, dust, sweat, and smell. Removing it was understood as release rather than loss. This belief rested on the idea that illness did not simply exist inside the body. Disease was imagined as something that moved, settled, and clung. It attached itself to surfaces and lingered where it could hide. Hair, thick and persistent, seemed like a natural shelter. It covered the head, brushed the neck, fell across the face, and absorbed the traces of daily life. If sickness needed a place to remain, hair appeared to offer it willingly. Cleansing through removal followed naturally from this logic. Shaving the head, or cutting hair close to the skin, stripped away what illness might be holding. The body was exposed and simplified. This exposure mattered deeply. A bare head suggested openness. Nothing remained to conceal sickness. The act marked a clear separation between the time of illness and whatever might follow. Hair cutting for healing was rarely casual. It was often tied to ritual and timing. Certain days were chosen. Specific signs or dreams guided the decision. The act might be performed by a healer, an elder, or a close family member. Tools were basic. Sharp stones, shells, or early blades were used. Pain pulling and small cuts were expected. Discomfort was accepted as necessary. The removal of hair carried emotional weight. Hair was tied to identity, age, and status. Cutting it signaled seriousness. A person who shaved their head for healing demonstrated commitment. They showed willingness to change themselves to survive. This willingness mattered as much as the act itself. In cases of prolonged illness, hair removal often came after other methods failed. Smoke had not worked, fire had not worked, scent and ritual had not worked. Cutting hair felt like a deeper cleansing. It did not attack the body directly. It removed what surrounded it. This indirect approach offered hope when direct methods had only caused pain. Children were frequently subjected to this practice. A sick child inspired fear and urgency. Shaving a child's head felt protective rather than cruel. Parents believed they were freeing the child from something clinging invisibly. When improvement followed, belief strengthened quickly. When death followed, the act itself was rarely questioned. Illness had simply been stronger. Hair removal also served as a visible marker of sickness. A shaved head announced vulnerability. It told others that the person had been unwell. This visibility mattered. Care increased. Expectations shifted. The sick person was watched more closely. Healing became communal rather than private. From a modern perspective, hair removal can reduce parasites and improve hygiene. These effects were not understood scientifically, yet they were sometimes noticed. A shaved scalp itched less. Skin felt cooler. Comfort improved slightly. These changes reinforced belief even if they did not address the illness itself. Danger existed quietly. Cutting tools were not clean. Small cuts could become infected. Removing hair exposes skin to cold sun and insects. These risks were accepted without hesitation. Illness already threatened life. Additional danger felt minor by comparison. Hair was also believed to carry personal history. It grew during periods of fear, hunger, sickness, and grief. Removing it symbolized shedding that history. The body was given a chance to begin again. This sense of renewal mattered deeply in a long illness where time itself felt heavy. Ritual often followed the act. Hair was not discarded carelessly. It might be burned, buried, or placed far from living areas. Disposal mattered. Illness trapped in the hair needed to be removed completely. Burning transformed it. Burying returned it to the earth. Leaving it behind risked contamination. Healers emphasized seriousness throughout the process. Silence, chanting, or focused attention surrounded the act. The sound of hair being cut carried weight. Each movement felt deliberate. Observers watched closely. Healing unfolded within the group, not behind closed doors. Hair removal also reinforced obedience to tradition. Those who complied demonstrated trust. Those who resisted risked blame if illness continued. Participation mattered. Healing depended on acceptance of shared belief. This practice reveals how prehistoric healing often targeted symbols rather than systems. The body was understood through what could be seen and touched. Removing hair felt like removing illness itself. The absence of hair created a sense of lightness and clarity, even if sickness remained. The unsettling aspect of this method lies in its simplicity. Cutting hair feels harmless. It feels clean. Danger hides quietly. Infection, exposure, and false hope followed without warning. The act reassured even when it did not cure. Hair removal endured across cultures and centuries. Even as knowledge changed, the association between hair and illness remained. Shaving continued to mark sickness, mourning, or renewal. The idea that hair holds something unwanted proved difficult to abandon. This method also shows how healing merged with identity. The body's appearance changed alongside belief. Healing was visible. Recovery or decline played out on the surface of the body. The body stripped of hair stood exposed to care and risk alike. Illness had been confronted symbolically. Whether it left or stayed, the act itself brought a sense of completion. Removing hair was believed to free the body from what illness clung to and refused to release. Yet when sickness lingered even after the body was stripped, bare attention turned away from the surface and toward what could be taken inside. What people chose to swallow afterward reveals how far healing was willing to go when nothing else remained. In some prehistoric communities, healing reached a point where the boundary between the living and the dead became thin. When sickness endured beyond tolerance and every external effort failed, attention turned to what could be taken into the body. Drinking liquids infused with human remains emerged as an extreme response to exhaustion, fear, and the loss of other options. This act was not understood as contamination. It was understood as a transfer. The belief behind this practice rested on the idea that vitality was not abstract. Strength, resilience, and endurance were treated as substances that could move from one body to another. A healthy person possessed excess life. A sick person lacked it. The solution in this logic was not removal but replenishment. What remained of the strong could restore what had drained from the weak. Bones held a central place in this thinking. They endured after flesh disappeared. Long after decay erased other traces, bone remained firm and recognizable. This persistence granted authority. Bone represented survival beyond death. Grinding bones into powder or soaking them in water allowed that endurance to be shared. The liquid became a carrier of something time itself had failed to destroy. Ash carried a different kind of meaning. Fire transformed the body completely. What remained after burning was believed to be purified of weakness and memory. Ash was seen as a concentrated essence, stripped of decay. Mixing ash with water created a substance believed to deliver vitality without burden. The act felt controlled, deliberate, and final. These practices followed ritual rather than impulse. The remains used were not chosen randomly. Often they belonged to individuals admired for strength, bravery, or resilience. Honoring their remains honored them. It allowed their qualities to persist among the living. Healing became an act of remembrance rather than violation. Families sometimes participated willingly. Offering the remains of a relative was framed as devotion. The dead had already crossed a boundary. Sharing what remained allowed the living to continue. Grief and hope coexisted within the ritual. Loss became contribution. Preparation mattered. Bones were cleaned, dried, and crushed using stone tools. Ash was gathered carefully and stored separately. Water used in the mixture often came from specific sources, believed to carry purity or power. Each step reinforced the meaning. Structure replaced improvisation. The act of drinking was deliberate and slow. Silence often surrounded the moment. Attention focused inward. The liquid was swallowed carefully. The body was expected to react. Warmth, nausea, dizziness, or discomfort were interpreted as signs of transfer. The reaction itself confirmed significance. From a modern perspective, the danger is evident. Human remains can carry toxins. Ash can irritate internal tissues. Bone powder can contaminate water. Poisoning was possible. Death sometimes followed. Within the belief system, these outcomes did not invalidate the practice. The illness had been too severe. The body had rejected the gift. The ritual remained intact. Children were rarely subjected to this method, though desperation sometimes erased restraint. Adults were more commonly chosen. Their bodies were expected to endure the ingestion. Survival following the act reinforced the belief strongly. Recovery stories traveled farther than quiet deaths. This practice appeared unevenly across regions. It often coincided with scarcity, prolonged illness, or crisis. When survival felt fragile, boundaries shifted. What was once unthinkable became necessary. Healing adapted to fear rather than comfort. Psychologically, the effect was powerful. Drinking remains created continuity. The sick person felt accompanied. Someone stronger was believed to exist within them. This belief altered the perception of weakness. Endurance increased. Sometimes recovery followed, reinforcing trust. The communal aspect mattered. Witnesses shared responsibility. Everyone present understood the gravity of the act. Healing was no longer private. It belonged to the group. Shared belief amplified impact. This practice also redefined the meaning of nourishment. Food was not only sustenance, it was identity, memory, and strength. Ingesting remains blurred lines between nourishment and ritual. The body became a vessel for meaning as much as substance. The unsettling nature of this method lies in its calmness. There was no visible struggle, no force. The danger entered quietly. The body accepted it willingly. Harm arrived without warning. This approach reveals how healing could transform into symbolic ingestion. Strength was taken in, rather than applied outwardly. The body was treated as empty rather than obstructed. Filling replaced removal. Such rituals challenge modern assumptions about taboo. Within their context, they were acts of hope rather than horror. Survival justified extremity. Meaning softened fear. The persistence of these practices shows a deep desire for continuity. Death did not end usefulness. The boundary between the living and the dead remained permeable. Healing borrowed from both sides. In prehistoric healing, ingestion marked profound trust. What entered the body shaped fate. Drinking remains represented surrender to belief when control was gone. This method stood at the edge of desperation. It did not replace other responses. It appeared when persuasion, force, and cleansing failed. Healing no longer tried to change the surface. It aimed to alter what lived inside. Over time, stories preserved the logic of these acts. They warned of risk and promised renewal. Communities remembered both outcomes. Memory guided repetition. This practice shows how belief can drive action beyond comfort and safety. It demonstrates how humans seek meaning, even in danger. Healing became acceptance of risk in exchange for hope. This practice framed weakness as something that could be filled rather than fought. Attention moved inward, turning belief toward what the body might absorb. The final step exposes how far healing would travel once the boundary between bodies is no longer held. Cutting into one's own body emerged in prehistoric healing at a moment when illness felt personal, invasive, and stubborn. When pain settled into a specific place and refused to move, some communities believed the body itself had become a prison for something unwanted. If sickness entered through unseen means, then opening the body might allow it to leave. Self-incision became a way to give illness an exit. This practice focused on location. Cuts were not made randomly. They targeted areas where pain was felt most strongly. A throbbing joint, a swollen limb, or a persistent ache drew attention. The body was read as a map. Where suffering spoke, action followed. Cutting that spot felt logical. If illness had gathered there, then blood released from that place could carry it away. Blood held a central meaning. It was warm, visible, and alive. When it flowed, it confirmed that something inside had moved. Blood leaving the body was interpreted as proof that illness was being expelled. The darker or thicker the blood appeared, the more convincing the result felt. Observation replaced understanding. The act of cutting varied in severity. Some incisions were shallow, meant to draw a small amount of blood. Others were deeper, intended to release more. Tools were simple. Sharp stones, thorns, or bone fragments were used. Cleanliness was not considered. What mattered was the opening itself. Self-incision was often voluntary. The person believed to be ill performed the act themselves, or allowed it without resistance. Enduring pain demonstrated commitment. Pain was not an obstacle. It was confirmation that the act mattered. If healing required suffering, then suffering was accepted. The ritual surrounding the act mattered as much as the cut. Silence or focused attention often preceded the incision. Words might be spoken softly or not at all. The moment was treated seriously. Witnesses observed closely. Healing was never entirely private. The community shared responsibility for what followed. In some cases, repeated cutting occurred. If pain returned, the body was opened again. Persistence reinforced belief. Failure did not immediately discredit the method. Illness was stubborn. More effort was required. From a modern perspective, the dangers are obvious. Open wounds invite infection. Blood loss weakens the body. Tools carried bacteria. Death sometimes followed not from illness, but from the attempt to cure it. Within the belief system, these outcomes did not negate the practice. The illness had been too strong. The body had already been compromised. Children were sometimes subjected to this method, though more cautiously. A child's blood was believed to carry innocence and purity. Releasing it could relieve illness more easily. This belief intensified risk. Smaller bodies weakened faster. Death followed more quickly. Grief did not erase belief. Self-incision offered something that other methods did not. It gave the sick person control. Rather than waiting, they acted. Cutting transformed passive suffering into an active response. This sense of agency mattered deeply. Even when the body weakened, the mind felt engaged. The visibility of blood played a psychological role. Seeing blood flow created immediate feedback. Something had changed. Healing felt underway. This feedback loop reinforced repetition. Relief that followed even briefly confirmed belief. Healers sometimes guided where and how to cut. Their experience mattered. They learned through observation. Certain places bled more safely than others. Knowledge was passed quietly. Success stories mattered more than failures. This practice reflects a belief that illness was a physical presence rather than a process. If sickness occupied space, then creating an opening could release it. The body became a container that needed venting. This logic made sense within lived experience. The unsettling aspect lies in how easily harm was reframed as a cure. Pain and blood loss were not warnings. They were evidence. The more dramatic the act, the more convincing it felt. Subtlety was mistrusted. Visible change was valued. Self-incision also blurred boundaries between healing and punishment. The body suffered to restore balance. Pain became payment. Healing demanded sacrifice, even if that sacrifice was one's own flesh. This method often appeared alongside others. Cutting did not replace ritual scent or amulets. It escalated the response. When gentler approaches failed, cutting offered intensity. It promised results proportional to suffering. The practice reveals how healing could turn inward aggressively. Rather than negotiating with spirits or borrowing strength, the body itself was forced to release what was wrong. The sick person became both patient and instrument. Survivors reinforced the belief. Scars healed. Pain faded. These bodies became proof. Those who died were remembered differently. Their illness had been too powerful. The method itself remained intact. Self-incision shows the desperation that shaped prehistoric healing. It demonstrates how fear can justify harm, framed as hope. It exposes the thin line between care and destruction. This method persisted because it offered certainty in action, even when the outcome was uncertain. Doing something felt better than waiting. Blood flowing meant illness was leaving. That belief mattered. In the absence of understanding, a sensation-guided decision is made. Pain meant engagement. Blood meant movement. Stillness meant danger. Cutting ensured nothing remained hidden. The body opened, deliberately became a site of confrontation. Healing no longer circled the illness. It cut directly into it. This approach treated sickness as something forced out through pain and blood. Attention narrowed entirely toward flesh, turning the body into the final barrier to be confronted. The path taken afterward hints at a remedy where the body itself became medicine. Chewing fresh plants before placing them onto the body became a healing practice when illness felt close to the surface yet difficult to reach with tools. In these moments, the mouth replaced the hand and the body itself became part of the preparation. Leaves were not simply applied as they were found. They were transformed first, broken down by teeth, mixed with saliva, warmed by breath. This transformation mattered. It marked the plant as active rather than raw. The choice of plants followed memory rather than classification. Healers and families relied on taste, smell, and experience. Bitter leaves were favored because bitterness suggested strength. Plants that numbed the tongue or caused tingling felt powerful. Sharp reactions were welcomed. A plant that did nothing was considered weak. These judgments were not random. They were shaped by repetition across generations. Chewing was slow and deliberate. Leaves were crushed thoroughly until fibers softened and juices released fully. Saliva mixed into the paste, changing the texture and smell. This mixture mattered more than the plant alone. Saliva was believed to carry life force. It was warm, came from inside the body, and contained breath. Adding saliva meant adding intention. The healer was not distant from the cure. They were part of it. Once prepared, the paste was applied directly to the body. Placement followed pain. Swollen joints, aching muscles, inflamed skin, or infected wounds drew attention. The paste was pressed firmly onto the area, sometimes layered thickly, sometimes spread thin. Leaves, cloth, or fibers held it in place. Contact was essential. The longer the paste remained, the more transfer was believed to occur. The belief behind this practice rested on connection. Saliva linked bodies. It carried warmth and presence. By placing chewed plants onto another person, the healer shared more than medicine. They shared effort, breath, and energy. Healing became relational rather than mechanical. Illness was not confronted alone. Family members often performed this act. A parent chewing leaves for a child carried deep meaning. Care passed directly from mouth to skin. This closeness reassured both sides. The sick person felt attended to. The caregiver felt useful. Fear eased even before physical change appeared. This practice was especially common for localized pain. A sore joint, a swollen limb, or a persistent ache invited direct application. An illness that felt contained was treated as something that could be calmed from the outside. The body did not need to be opened. It needed to be soothed and persuaded. Some plants used in this way did have real effects. Certain leaves reduced inflammation or eased pain when applied topically. These effects were noticed through experience. Relief that followed reinforced belief in the entire method. The role of saliva and ritual is blended with physical response. Cause and meaning merged. The ritual aspect mattered as much as the substance. Chewing requires time and focus. It could not be rushed. This slowness calmed the space around the sick person. Attention narrowed. Healing became the only concern. This focused presence altered the perception of pain. Feeling cared for changed how pain was experienced. From a modern perspective, risk was present. Saliva carried bacteria. Applying chewed paste to open wounds invites infection. Some plants contained toxins. These dangers were invisible. When harm followed, belief adjusted rather than collapsed. The illness had been stronger. The plant had been unsuitable. The method itself remained trusted. Children were frequent recipients of this treatment. Their small bodies reacted quickly to touch and warmth. Parents watched for calmer breathing or reduced crying. Even temporary relief mattered. Stories of improvement spread quietly through families. Memory favored success. Healers sometimes guided which plants to chew and how long to apply them. Their knowledge elevated their status. Healing did not require distance or authority. It required familiarity with land and a willingness to share one's own body in the process. This practice blurred boundaries between treatment and intimacy. The healer's mouth participated directly. Healing was not delivered, it was shared. This sharing created trust and obligation. The sick person accepted not only the paste, but the presence behind it. The unsettling aspect lies in how easily care could become harm. The same closeness that comforted also exposed. Infection traveled quietly. Damage appeared later. The method felt gentle, which made danger harder to recognize. Chewing and applying plants also reflected a belief that healing could be awakened through transformation. Plants change state in the mouth. Bodies change through contact. Change itself was trusted. Movement, warmth, and mixture signaled action. This approach endured because it felt human. It required no tools, no distance, no spectacle. Healing happened wherever pain appeared. It adapted easily to daily life. In a world filled with harsh methods, this one felt personal. Even when ineffective, the practice satisfied the need to act. Doing something felt better than waiting. Chewing leaves gave the hands and mouth a task. Waiting turned into care. The body, marked by plant paste and saliva, became a site of exchange. Illness was met with shared substance rather than removal. Healing relied on closeness rather than force. This practice shows how healing often depended on a relationship. The sick person was not isolated. Someone stayed close, chewing, waiting, watching. Presence itself became part of the cure. Over time, the method persisted not because it always worked, but because it answered fear with action. It replaced helplessness with involvement. It allowed people to feel connected rather than powerless. Chewed plants turned healing into an act of shared effort rather than distant treatment. Attention shifted toward contact warmth and substances prepared by the human body itself. This reliance on closeness set the stage for a method where heat replaced touch entirely. Heat became a solution when illness was imagined as something cold, heavy, and unwilling to move. In prehistoric thinking, pain that settled in the abdomen or chest did not arrive by chance. These areas were linked to breath, digestion, and life itself. When discomfort lingered there, it was understood as cold energy trapped inside the body. Cold was passive, stubborn, and dangerous. Heat, by contrast, was active. It moved, spread, and forced things to change. Hot stones were chosen as tools capable of driving unwanted forces outward. The selection of stones mattered. Smooth, dense rocks were preferred because they held heat longer and cracked less easily. Stones collected from riverbeds or fire pits were trusted more than brittle ones found elsewhere. A stone that survived repeated exposure to flame was believed to possess endurance. That endurance was expected to pass into the body during treatment. The object itself carried meaning beyond its physical properties. Heating the stones required attention. Stones were placed near the fire or buried in embers until warmth spread evenly through them. Excessive heat was dangerous, yet insufficient heat was useless. Judgment guided the process. Healers tested stones by hovering a hand nearby or touching briefly. Pain was acceptable. Burning was not the goal, even though it sometimes occurred. Balance was learned through repetition. The application focused on the abdomen and chest because these regions were considered central. Pain there felt threatening in a way pain in limbs did not. A hot stone pressed against the belly or chest delivered warmth directly into the body's core. The sensation was intense. Muscles tightened, breath caught, and then slowly tension eased. Observers watched these reactions closely. Relaxation was taken as evidence that heat was working. Stones were often wrapped in cloth leaves or animal hide before being applied. This layer softened the heat and reduced immediate injury. Wrapping also carried symbolic weight. Natural materials were believed to cooperate with the stone, creating harmony rather than confrontation. The body was surrounded by elements working together. The belief behind this practice was straightforward. Heat encouraged movement. Cold caused stagnation. If illness lingered, it needed to be forced into motion. Sweating that followed treatment was welcomed. Moisture leaving the body was interpreted as sickness departing. Any visible change reinforced belief. Temporary relief often followed. Warmth eased muscle tension. Cramping softened. Breathing felt deeper. These immediate effects mattered more than the long-term outcome. Healing was judged by sensation rather than duration. Even if pain returned later, the moment of relief validated the method. Hot stones were also used for manual pressure. Rounded stones were pressed and rolled along the body, targeting areas believed to hold blockage. The stone replaced the healer's fingers. Its weight added authority. Pressure caused discomfort, yet the discomfort felt purposeful. The body responded visibly, which encouraged repetition. Children were treated more cautiously. Smaller stones were used. Heat exposure was shorter. Fear of burning existed, but illness felt more frightening. Parents watched closely for signs of relief. Even a brief calm justified the risk in their minds. From a modern perspective, burns were common. Skin blistered, tissue damaged, infection followed. These outcomes were rarely connected directly to treatment. Burns were viewed as separate injuries rather than consequences. The method itself remained trusted because it aligned with visible effects. This practice offered a sense of control. The healer decided temperature placement and duration. Action replaced waiting. Heat felt active and immediate. In a world where illness often progressed silently, doing something tangible mattered. The ritual surrounding hot stones was usually quiet. Focus was important. Distraction weakened the effect. The body needed to feel the heat fully. Endurance demonstrated seriousness. Those who endured pain without protest were seen as committed to recovery. Hot stone treatment is often followed by gentler approaches. When scent plant paste or chewing, failed heat represented escalation. It did not require cutting or blood. It promised strength without opening the body. This balance made it appealing. The unsettling aspect lies in how easily harm blends with care. Pain felt useful. Burns felt like proof. The line between healing and injury blurred. Suffering was reinterpreted as progress rather than arning. This method reinforced the belief that illness could be physically pushed out. The body became a space to be cleared. Heat served as a force. Resistance was expected. Victory was felt through exhaustion and sweat. Hot stones appeared across cultures because they aligned with observation. Warmth relaxes muscles. Cold stiffened them. These patterns were real. Symbolic explanation filled the gap left by limited understanding. The body responded visibly to heat. Muscles softened. Breathing slowed. These responses convinced observers that healing had begun. Belief deepened with every visible reaction. Accessibility ensured the survival of the method. Stones and fire were always available. Healing could occur anywhere. No special tools were required. This simplicity allowed the practice to persist. Danger remained constant. Burns scarred skin. Infection weakened bodies already struggling. Yet belief adapted. Failure was blamed on severity rather than method. The stone was never wrong. Illness was stronger. This approach shows how healing relied on sensation to replace understanding. Feeling change mattered more than knowing the cause. Heat promised movement. Movement promised life. The body endured heat, just as it endured illness. Endurance itself became proof of strength. Survival justified pain. Over time, scars left by burns became marks of effort rather than injury. They reminded survivors of battles fought inside the body. Pain was reframed as evidence of resistance. Hot stone healing reveals how far people were willing to go to feel agency over suffering. It transformed fear into action. It replaced uncertainty with sensation. Even when harm followed, belief held firm. Hot stones turned warmth into a force meant to drive sickness away from the body's center. Relief felt immediate, convincing both patient and witness that something had shifted. That search for certainty would eventually reach a point where gratitude replaced endurance. Tonight, before sleep fully settles in, let us pause together and look back at the long path that has just unfolded. What you have heard is not a collection of curiosities meant to shock, but a quiet record of how fragile life once was and how fiercely people clung to it. These were not reckless choices made for spectacle. They were decisions shaped by fear, hope, pain, and love, made in a world where survival itself was uncertain from one sunrise to the next. Prehistoric healing methods may feel distant, even disturbing, yet they were born from the same instinct that guides people today, the refusal to surrender easily. Without knowledge of bacteria, organs, or chemistry, early humans relied on what they could see, feel, and endure. Blood was visible, heat was tangible, pain was undeniable. In a world without explanations, sensation became truth. If something hurt, it felt powerful. If something changed the body, it felt meaningful. Healing was measured not by certainty, but by action. Every method you encountered carried risk. Some involved fire, others cutting, others poison, sacrifice, or intimacy that blurred boundaries between care and harm. Each one reminds us that life once stood on a thin edge. There were no guarantees, no labels, no warnings, no instructions. Survival depended on belief as much as endurance. People did not know whether a remedy would save or kill them, yet they chose to act anyway. Doing nothing felt more dangerous than doing something. When we look at these practices from the present, it is easy to judge them as cruel or foolish. Yet judgment fades when we remember what was missing. There were no hospitals, no trained physicians, no standardized medicine. There was only the body, the land, and the community. Knowledge traveled through memory, not books. Success was remembered more vividly than failure. Loss became part of daily life. Grief was familiar. Death was expected. Against that backdrop, even the most extreme remedies made sense. What stands out most is not the danger, but the courage hidden beneath it. People accepted pain, risked infection, endured burns, swallowed poison, and even sacrificed loved ones because they believed survival demanded everything. They did not see these acts as barbaric. They saw them as necessary. Healing was not gentle because life itself was not gentle. The body was tested because the world tested it constantly. As the story moves forward into modern times, the contrast becomes clearer. Today, medicine often works quietly. Pills dissolve without sensation. Injections sting briefly. Surgery happens under sleep. Healing now is measured by recovery, not endurance. Pain is treated as a problem, not proof. This shift is easy to overlook because it feels normal. Yet normal is a privilege earned through centuries of loss. Modern medicine did not appear suddenly. It rose slowly, built on countless failures, tragedies, and experiments that no one would wish to repeat. Every safety standard, every dosage guideline, every sterile instrument exists because something once went terribly wrong. The calm of modern healthcare rests on a foundation of suffering that rarely gets acknowledged. When you take medicine today, it does not ask for belief. It does not require pain as evidence. It does not demand sacrifice. It works whether you trust it or not. That quiet reliability would have felt miraculous to someone living thousands of years ago. A fever that breaks without ritual. A wound that heals without burning. A child who survives without scars. These outcomes would have seemed impossible. This is why gratitude matters. Not loud gratitude, not dramatic gratitude, but quiet awareness. Awareness that the safety surrounding modern life is not accidental. Awareness that comfort is not guaranteed by nature. Awareness that behind every tablet, every diagnosis, every treatment lies a history of desperation and endurance. Tonight, as your body rests, it does so in a world shaped by knowledge rather than fear. You sleep knowing that pain does not have to be endured to be understood. You sleep knowing that illness does not have to be confronted with fire or blood. You sleep knowing that help exists beyond belief. Let this awareness settle gently. Let it soften the weight of the stories you have heard. These were not tales meant to disturb your rest, but reminders of how far humanity has traveled. The past was harsh, not because people were cruel, but because they were trying to survive without answers. As the night deepens, allow your breathing to slow. Let the images fade. The heat of stones, the sting of cuts, the bitterness of plants, the silence of rituals, all of it belongs to another time. You do not need to carry it forward. You only need to remember that life once demanded much more from those who wish to keep it. Tonight you rest in a world where healing does not require suffering as proof. You rest in a world where care is measured, studied, and refined. You rest in a world built on the lessons paid for by generations who lived without protection. May this understanding bring calm rather than unease. May it remind you that safety is something earned, not assumed. May it help you release tension instead of holding it. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. Thank you for listening with patience and curiosity. Stories like these are heavy, yet they matter because they show how fragile life once was and how precious it still is. Now there is nothing left to examine, nothing left to endure, nothing left to confront. The past can remain where it belongs. Your body can rest without vigilance. Take a slow breath in. Let it out gently. Allow sleep to come without effort. Good night.